Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. The first thing we're going to do is to complete the evidence of Mr. O'Loughlin. Good morning, Mr. O'Loughlin.
Morning, sir.
All ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, good morning. Morning, Mr. O'Loughlin.
Morning.
Thank you for coming back to us. We're very grateful. Can I start this morning really where I left off last night? And that is where you were coming to the end of your period in command as incident commander. During the entirety of the period you were incident commander, do you remember telling anybody at control that crews were struggling to get above the 15th floor?
As incident commander, no, I didn't speak directly with control, and I wasn't aware of that at that point in time.
You weren't aware?
As incident commander.
We've had some evidence from DAC Fenton and Operations Manager Joe Smith from control that they had been informed that crews were struggling to get above the 15th floor, and that had been an ingredient in their decision to change the stay put advice. Can you help? Where might that have information, or where did that information
Didn't come directly
to the best
from
of
me.
your knowledge?
The only contact I'm aware of directly with control was either Dan Merrick, who was receiving information from control, or from the Fire Survival Guidance Unit, which I'd asked to make contact with control. So my expectation would be it's come from the Fire Survival Guidance Unit.
Right.
It's the only place, but I wasn't aware of it as incident commander.
You weren't aware of it as incident
No.
commander? Right. Can I then take you to page 17 of your statement and ask you please to look at the bottom? In the last paragraph there you say, I was then informed by one of the command team that the stay put advice had been changed by control. Just pausing there, can you remember how long before you handed incident command over to Andy Rowe that you were informed that the stay put advice had been changed by control?
Probably no more than 2 to 3 minutes.
No more than 2 to 3 minutes. Do you remember who told you?
It was one of the watch managers who'd come on to the command unit, so it wasn't Dan Merrick or Mark Kempfield, it was another watch manager.
Another watch manager. And do you know where he or she had been?
I don't know where he'd been, no. He'd come on the unit and they'd gone to sit opposite where Dan Merrick had been sitting. I think he'd taken over from Mark Kempfield as the team leader. He'd spoken with Mark Kempfield as well, I think, around that time as well.
Right. Had that watch manager been on CU7? Do you know?
I don't know if he'd been on CU7. He came on CU8 at some point during the time I was in charge.
Right.
And he started doing work on CU8.
Do you know whether that watch manager had him or herself been in touch with the control room or had got that information from somewhere else?
The information regarding stay put, he had a telephone. He was on the telephone and he just put the telephone down. He interrupted a conversation I was having with another officer and said that he had something as a priority to tell me. So he actually interrupted a conversation I was having.
And just describe the scene for me. He was on the phone, was he?
I think he'd just finished on the phone, so he probably had a mobile phone in his hand.
Right.
And he'd stopped using that and he'd kind of interrupted. He didn't shout, he just in a louder voice, he said something, I've got something as a priority. So it means I had to stop whatever I was doing with the conversation I was having.
Right.
And I asked him what it was and he just said, controllers changed to stay put.
Did you ask him who at control had told him that?
I asked him to do that for me. I said, find out who has made that decision at control.
And
to do that, he then had to phone control back.
Did he do that? Did he phone control back?
He did, yes.
Who did he speak to, do you know?
I don't know who he spoke to. He told me that it was DAC Adrian Fenton that had changed it. And then he clarified it as well. So the first one, it was just stay put. As they said, stay put has changed. And the second conversation afterwards, he said that DAC Adrian Fenton had changed it and they started talking about fire survival guidance and they changed stay put for fire survival guidance.
Right. You say, well, next question. Were you, to the best of your knowledge, asked for your permission as incident commander at the time to change stay put, or you just took it as a fait accompli from control?
I wasn't asked for permission. It was the way it came through was it had been changed by control, right. And that's the reason I asked to find out who had changed it.
Now you say my first reaction was surprise, as no one had spoken to me. Does that mean that normally you would be consulted on whether stay put, the revocation of stay put, would occur?
The incident commander should be consulted on a decision like that. On the understanding of this incident, there was an enormous amount going on, not only on the fire ground and in control.
Right.
So the expectation, if you like, at a normal incident we'd attend would be that you'd speak to the incident commander about a change of decision like that.
Yes, I think we covered this yesterday, but in your experience, had you ever been incident commander at an incident where you had decided to revoke stay put?
No, I've not been in an incident where we've had to change stay put.
So your surprise was based on what?
So the surprise was because they said stay put, I thought they meant, my expectation was they meant the people who were in unaffected flats. So we'd be asking people in unaffected flats if we could somehow communicate them to leave via the staircase, which at that point in time I didn't know was clear of smoke.
Well, that takes me to the next question. What did you understand the advice would now be as a result of the change that you speak of here in your statement?
So after the second phone call, which was probably less than a minute later, so he phoned them back immediately, and within 30 seconds he was speaking back to me and said that it was Adrian Fenton who'd made the decision.
Right.
And I knew control, and therefore probably Adrian Fenton was also in contact with the FSG unit. So my expectation was that they got information from the FSG unit that I didn't yet have, that told them something about the conditions in the building that meant that they could, or they were going to change their advice for some people. But when they talked about being fire survival guidance, I thought, well, the key point of fire survival guidance is to tell people to leave if they can anyway. So it felt like they were just going to reinforce in fire survival guidance, if you can leave, you should leave. But for me, that was always part of fire survival guidance anyway. If you can leave, going around in the cycle of checking again and again if you can leave, then it just meant it felt like they were going to reinforce it to people if they felt they can leave. But materially, it might not have actually made much difference, because people who were in flats and trapped by, for example, thick black smoke still wouldn't be able to leave.
Did you ask the watch manager to go back to Adrian Fenton and clarify precisely what the new advice was to be in place of stay put?
I didn't know. It felt like they were going to. So to me, my understanding then was that if people on fire survival guidance were phoning up, they were going to be told to leave, which would be what I'd expect them to be told anyway. And it seemed like we were talking about stay put when we should have been talking about fire survival guidance. So it seemed confused which one they meant.
Did you seek to clarify that confusion?
Not at that point in time, no.
Why is that?
Within, I think, 30 seconds or a minute of that came in the information from the FSG unit regarding the number of casualties, or number of people involved, sorry. And then following that, Andy Rowe got onto the unit.
Right.
So that all happened within probably 3 minutes, I think, maybe 4 minutes, but not a long time.
Right. You said a minute ago, the last answer but one, that your understanding was that if people on fire survival guidance were phoning up, they were going to be told to leave, which would be what I would expect to them to be told anyway. Is that really right, Mr. O'Loughlin? Would you expect any FSG caller who says, I am an FSG caller, to be told to leave if in fact they were trapped?
Well, they only become an FSG caller once they say they are trapped and they can't leave their flat. So if they phone up and say they're being affected by smoke, my expectation is they are told the best thing to do is leave. Of course, in a block of flats, that's more difficult, because particularly in this one, it was very difficult to ensure that their escape route was safe. But if they've got smoke affecting them already, they'll still be safer to get away from that smoke.
Yeah.
Once they say they cannot leave, that's when it becomes a fire survival guidance call.
Yes.
And at that point, the control operator should be assessing their conditions, if there's any alternative means of escape, and working out, is there a way to get them out. But if it's clear that that person is trapped by either the smoke, heat or flames and they cannot leave, then that is a fire survival guidance call, and that's my expectation on the night.
Yes. And since those people are trapped and genuine FSG callers, as opposed to people who are affected by smoke but might be able to leave, would you not then need to assess, or would the caller not, the operator not need to be able to assess the safety of the exit routes before that person could leave?
Yes, I mean, by that point, I think that's the coordination between the FSG unit and control regarding individual calls. So it's very difficult for the control officers to assess the conditions for them to escape.
Right.
It was because they'd used stay put in the term when we were talking about fire survival guidance, it became unclear what they meant. I think my understanding at the point was they were going to try and encourage people on the fire survival guidance calls to check again if they could leave, which I was expecting them to do anyway.
I see.
So materially, I wasn't sure it was going to make a lot of difference, actually, because the fire survival guidance calls, if you are trapped by thick black smoke or heat and flame, you still can't leave even though you're told to.
I see. So is this right, that what you thought was happening by way of changing the stay put advice, as you'd been told, was a reassessment of the possibility of exit rather than get out at all costs?
No, I think it was that probably a reassessment, yeah. So encouraging, so the people who are saying they are trapped, can you still leave? My expectation still is that anyone else who's phoning up and says they're affected by smoke, they'll be told to leave. The confusion was that because they put stay put in there, it was people who are in a safe place were going to be told to leave.
Right.
My thoughts were they've been speaking to the FSG unit, and I hadn't had an update for some time, so that they may have had a better idea at that point in time of the conditions in the staircase, and that they may have known through a conversation with the FSG unit what the conditions were, and that it may have been safer for some people to leave the building.
Up to that point, just taking it in stages, let's take the category of people who are affected by smoke but aren't trapped. Up to that point, what was your expectation or knowledge as to the advice they were getting?
So if you are in a flat and you're not affected by the heat or smoke, then the expectation is you should be safer to stay where you are. If you phone up and you are affected by heat or smoke but you can escape, then you should try to escape. The difficulty in a block of flats is it could mean you are going into a smoke-filled lobby or a smoke-filled staircase, but if you're already in a smoke-filled environment, you're better off to still try and get somewhere that is safer.
Right.
And then the FSG is the final one, which actually someone says wherever they are, normally in a flat in this case, they cannot leave that flat, they cannot escape. And that could be because of the conditions in the flat, or it could be because of the conditions in the lobby, but they cannot get out.
Right. So on the night, I want to get your thought processes on the night rather than your understanding of the policy, which I appreciate. But on the night, what was your understanding of how the change in stay put would affect, first, the category of caller who was affected by smoke but not trapped?
They should be told to leave, still, as they should be.
As they should be. So no change there then?
No.
Right. And then next category, which is the people who are trapped, what was the change in stay put so far as they were concerned?
To me, it just reinforced the fact that you need to encourage them. If they think they can escape, then they should try to. So it was almost a reinforcement of the FSG anyway. It wasn't any material change by changing the stay put. It felt like the terms were getting confused. It went back to if an FSG caller thinks they can escape from what would be a very dangerous environment to them, they should try to.
Well, how is any of your understanding a change in stay put in any material sense?
I think I felt like the terminology was getting confused because when it first came through, it was just saying stay put. And the stay put for me at that point only affected the flats that were unaffected by the heat and smoke. So it felt like so that's why I wanted it checked initially, was that what does that mean for the people in unaffected flats potentially going into a smoke-filled environment? But on the second phone call from the command unit officer, he said that they mean the fire survival guidance people. They mean they're going to tell them not to stay put. And that was confusing because I wasn't expecting fire survival guidance and stay put to be used together. Fire survival guidance should be, if they can get out, tell them to get out.
So that second call back to the control room still left you confused?
It was slightly, yes, it was. Yes.
Did you seek to sort that confusion out?
Not within the following few minutes, no, because within those few minutes I handed over to Andy Rowe.
Was it? I'm just trying to get a feel for how you saw this in terms of importance. Was it not of absolutely critical importance to you to understand precisely now what the advice to FSG callers, properly so called, was?
It would have been, yes, as soon as I could get the opportunity to get that. But within a few minutes I handed over to Andy Rowe.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll come back to the handover in a moment. You then go on to say in the same paragraph, no new information had come to me, either via the fire sector or the FSG sector, as regards the need to change the stay put advice, and they had been in place for about 25 minutes by this point. Just a point of clarification, Mr. O'Loughlin, the they you're referring to is, am I right to assume, Richard Welch and Pat Goulbourne?
No, so that would be Richard Welsh as the fire sector and then Tom Goodall as the fire survival guidance.
Tom Goodall, okay. So fire sector, Goulbourne and Welch, and FSG Goodall.
Yeah, so the two sectors had not got back to me. Whether them, I wouldn't expect it from them directly necessarily, but no one had come back as a runner or anything like that with any updates.
So do we take from that you had been, as it were, sitting on the command unit, CU8, for 25 minutes with no information at all coming back from either of those sectors?
I hadn't got an update in that time, no.
Why did you allow that to happen?
The only option for me was to try and get the communications on the radios to get across them, which is what I asked Dan and the other command unit operator to do. But they just weren't getting any information back from them. And when that happens normally at fires, it means that they've got so much going on, they're just not getting the chance to get the updates to you. So you would normally send out an officer to get a check on it, or you'd send out your ORT team. But all those had gone out and still no information was coming back. Right. So what it was telling me was that the chances are they were dealing with so much they weren't getting the opportunity to get the information back to me.
Right. During this 25-minute period of silence, at what point in that 25 minutes did you realise that this silence had become a yawning gap and was a problem?
It wasn't silence as in the command unit. I mean, there was lots we were still trying to achieve. There was still a whole command structure to be put in place.
When I say silence, what I mean is no new information during that 25 minutes. Question again, at what point during the 25 minutes did it become apparent to you that... well, let me put it this way. did it become apparent to you during that 25 minutes that the lack of information from those two sources was becoming problematic for you in your role as incident commander?
It was clear during that time that I needed updates on how the fire was progressing, what the conditions were, and how we were doing with the FSG units, yes. So
okay.
And my only way to communicate through that at the point was through the radio communications on the unit, other than physically going back out again. Well, during that entire time, I was still putting the command team in place and briefing the police and ambulance service.
Yes, that was the next question. What was to stop you jumping off CU8, running up to CU7, and just putting your head around the door and just getting a quick snapshot as to what the position was?
So that was still putting the command team in place. So by the point, so Tom would have been probably put in place 15 minutes before that, right. Followed by Pat, followed by Dave, followed by Steve West, followed by the police and ambulance. And all that took probably the 10 or 15 minutes that we're talking about. So, right. So I'd have to stop all the other officers that are going to run the incident for me or assist me run the incident whilst I'm trying to go out to the fire ground and get the information that I need. So it was important to go and get that, but at that point in time I still needed to put the command team in place.
So the primacy, is this right? Just correct me if this is unfair or wrong. Your primary task was to put the command structure in place rather than to obtain information about what was actually going on the ground.
No, so I was still trying to get the information, but that would have been through the radio communicator, so the comms officer on the unit. So I was still trying to get the information, and you're relying upon your comms on the unit to get that for you. But I still need to put a team in place to help me put the fire out. So without the team, I can't put the fire out on my own. I need those there supporting me. So they were still trying to get the information, but the way we'd communicate is via the radio. Once I go out to the fire ground, you don't. Right. You're much more difficult to access, and you're much more difficult to run the incident once you're on the fire ground.
Okay. Can I then come back to the contents of the stay put change as you understood it? We've covered that, but I just want to show you something in your contemporaneous note. If you go to page 3, your note is at 5213, Appendix A, and in the middle of the page, under the rubric Issues Not in Time Order, you say, via command team from duty DAC, Adrian Fenton at control, they were going to tell residents to start to leave the premises rather than stay put. I acknowledged this and felt that it was appropriate for the scale of the incident, travel distances for firefighters, and due to the building's integrity being so compromised. My question is, when you see the words or use the words start to tell residents to start to leave the premises, is that, when you wrote this, was that intending to record that all residents should leave?
Yes, that's what it sounded. So because they changed stay put and they changed stay put in relation to fire survival guidance, it sounded like anyone who spoke to control was now going to be told to leave the building.
Right. So in light of that and in light of the answers you gave us this morning, try to link those together. Does that mean that people who weren't trapped should be told to get out at all costs?
Were trapped, you sorry.
So weren't trapped, but were affected by fire, heat and smoke?
If you're affected by the fire, heat and smoke, then yes, you should try to get out.
Right.
Because if the environment you can move into is better than the environment you're in, so if you're in a flat that's starting to be affected by thick black smoke, you'll be better off to move into a lobby or a staircase that's got less thick black smoke, for example.
Right. And those residents who were, as we've discussed before, genuine FSG callers who were trapped, they would be told, you say they would be encouraged but not commanded to leave.
They should always be told to escape. That's part of the cycle of getting them out if they can.
Right.
So is there an alternative means for them? If it was a maisonette, is there another way they can get out, for example?
Right.
My expectation was, encourage them to leave, but I would think that if they're in fire survival guidance and they're already saying I am trapped and I can't get out, even with encouragement, you can't really push yourself through either flames or thick black smoke. It doesn't really wait for you to. It's a very difficult environment to push yourself through or into.
Okay. So when we see the word residents there in that note, do we have to qualify that by saying, well, so far as FSG callers were concerned, they would be encouraged to leave, but not, as it were, told to?
I don't think it says they're told to leave. To start to leave, I suppose encouraged could be put in there. I guess, right. I suppose.
Now, my question is, given what you knew, why had you not made that decision as incident commander already?
So with regard to the fire survival guidance people, my expectation is that control will go through the cycle of working out if there's a way that they can escape and keep reassessing that to see if they can get out. But if they are unable to do that, then they are still caught in the cycle of being trapped within their flats. The people who are affected by smoke but can leave, I would expect they are being told to leave, because if they can move to a safer environment, so the lobbies or staircase that may have less smoke, People who are staying put or staying in their flats because they are unaffected, they were the ones that I wouldn't want to get them to go into a potentially smoke-filled staircase when they're actually, at the moment, unaffected by smoke at all.
Now, if you had, as you told us, received no new information over the past 25 minutes, or previous 25 minutes, from either the fire sector or the FSG sector, why was it at that point that you were able to agree that that change decision was appropriate?
So Adrian is a fellow DAC. He would have understood if he was speaking with the Fire Survival Guidance Unit, which I'd asked Tom to set up communications with the FSG, with Control, that at that point in time they would have had, at that point, probably better information than I had about the conditions because he was speaking directly with the FSG. So I had to trust that the communications that was going on between the two of them had identified that actually they could move people out into the staircase and or encourage people who were trapped in their flats to see if they could leave.
Does that mean that, but for what Control had decided, you wouldn't have made that decision at that point?
Based on the information that I had, so that the three separate groups, if you like, the FSGs, I would expect they are being told to escape if they can, but clearly the reason they're an FSG is they can't. People who are saying they've got smoke in their flats and they're being affected should be told to leave if they can get to a safer environment, such as a less smoke-logged staircase or corridor or lobby. The people who were staying in their flats, because they were unaffected, I would have kept them in their flats at that point in time until we could ensure that the staircase was clear enough for them to come down safely.
Right. But as far as they're concerned, that had changed. And my question, I'll just put it again, perhaps in a slightly different way. Is it the position that it was the information coming into Control that Adrian Fenton had that was the determinant of what advice to give occupants still in the building, rather than information that you had as incident commander?
Yeah, I think Adrian would have had more information about the details of the calls coming into Control than I had at that point in time, and he was talking to the FSG unit, which would have had information about what was going on inside the tower because they've been communicating with the fire sector.
So would it be fair to say that you were blind as to what they could see?
Not quite blind. I didn't have as much information as they had.
Right. Now, can I just ask you to look at a development point? It's in the IMP incident report, tab 30 of our documents bundle, which is at LFB *0003114. It's on page 5 of that document. In the middle of the page. And it's one of 4. You see your name starts about a third of the way down in the left-hand column, and then it's the third entry down, one of 4. Do you see it says, the incident commander must consider if the FSG stay put advice remains appropriate if the conditions within the building change. It is clear that whilst en route and on arrival you did consider the information being shared as part of FSG. It's the first point I want to ask you about that. Do you know why that development point was created?
So that was a result of the PRC that we had.
Yeah. Right, I see. So that's why. And when it says incident commander must consider if the FSG stay put advice remains appropriate, is that indicating that it is preferable or better for the incident commander to make that decision rather than the control room?
No, I think I expressed at the time when that was given to me that I thought it was confusing in itself because it's putting FSG and stay put together. So stay put should be the people unaffected in the building, and fire survival guidance was the people who are saying they are trapped in their flat, they're not being told to stay put. So I was confused when that was given, whether it was the FSG we were talking about or if it was the stay put, so the people in unaffected flats.
I see. Did you see this document in draft form before it went out?
I had a discussion, so the way the system works, you have feedback at the PRC.
Yeah.
So I had a discussion with the Deputy Commissioner for that particular point before we then went into the meeting for the feedback, and then it was provided in the meeting.
Right. I mean, so the expressions FSG stay put, I think you say is a nonsense, effectively.
I think it's not my understanding of it. So my understanding would be stay put applies to people who are unaffected, and the FSG is for people who are saying they cannot leave their flat. So when the two were put together, I was unclear exactly what we were talking about at that point.
Right. Now, having been told by this watch manager that control had changed the stay put advice, did you then have any thoughts as to how the withdrawal of stay put, as you understood it, would be affected, would be carried out?
So my first action was to get that message sent across to the two sectors, which I think I asked the comms officer to do. Materially, it may not have affected what we were trying to achieve. So again, coming back to the people who were trapped in their flats and could not leave, actually telling them to leave again might not actually help them at all, because they are still trapped by the same smoke or heat or flames that was trapping them originally. People who are being affected are still also should be getting told to leave, because they're getting smoke coming in, and if they think they get out, they should. What it would change is the people who were safe in their flats and now had to go into a staircase that we didn't know the conditions of.
Exactly, and I was going to come to that.
And with that, regarding that, I think I spoke to Richard when I got into the tower to say that them, as the operations commander, sorry, that there may be people now leaving their flats who will now be going to the corridor. So what's likely to occur is people will not be where we were expecting them to be. They could be in different parts of the building now, because they're now starting to move around. And also potentially people who are in flats that were unaffected by heat and smoke are now moving into the staircase, which could be potentially affected by heat and smoke.
Right. Now, let's break this down a little bit.
Of course.
In terms of numbers, did you do even a brief mental calculation about the numbers of occupants of the building that would now need to be evacuated?
So my estimate, when I was at the bottom of the tower, there'd be somewhere between 100 and 200 people within the building. It's probably closer to 200 rather than 100.
At the time you thought that, did you?
Yeah, I mean, in a quick calculation, it was 20 floors above the fire. There's 6 flats on each floor. If there's a couple of people in each floor, I think my maths has probably gone wrong there, but you're getting towards between 150 and 200 probably.
Right.
So a lot of people within the building.
Yes.
And so a lot of those, but with that said, the only people who would be leaving flats that they are safe in would be the ones who are phoning control, because we don't have a system on the fire ground to actually do that. So we can't, there's no fire alarm system, there's no tannoy system. So unless someone who is in a flat and is unaffected by smoke phones control and is then told to leave. So I still wasn't expecting a mass exodus, as it were. I was still thinking that people affected by fire survival guidance would still be trapped in their flats. Anyone who's phoning up and saying, I'm affected by smoke in my flat, would be trying to leave, and I'd expect that. Yeah. And then there would be some additional people who are phoning up who are unaffected, who may originally have been staying in their flats but would now be starting to leave. I hadn't tried to give an estimate on what I thought that would be, but it meant we were going to have an increased number of people going into the staircase than we originally may have thought, which is going to affect our operations and also the rescues on the upper floors.
And my question is, did you do a mental calculation to work out how many people were going to be coming into that staircase?
Not at that point in time, no, I didn't, no.
And if we do the maths now on the basis of 58 adults and 16 children...
At that point, I didn't know the 58 adults. So the 58 adults, 16 children came about probably 1 or 2 minutes after the stay put change was given to me.
Anyway, it's a lot of people.
A lot of people, yes.
Right, that's probably all we need for this purpose. The next question then is, how would you communicate that change in stay put to all those residents?
It's not easily done. So there's no mechanism at the tower for doing that, such as there was no fire alarm system, there's no tannoy system. So there's no proactive way of doing that. We did have some people who were phoning, I think, speaking to people in their flats on their telephones. That was much later on, as when I was operations commander, and I think they may have been getting told to leave at that point. But it was only the people phone control. So it's when people phone control that they get told to stay put if they're unaffected. So anyone phoning control would be told to leave. So there was no easy way of communicating that to everyone in the building.
There's no easy way. Was there a way at all?
No, there's no alarm system, there's no tannoy system, so there is no mechanism for contacting every individual flat in the building.
So do I take from that you were completely reliant on control doing the job of communicating to each resident the advice to leave, or encourage the FSG callers to leave?
It's not the only method, no. So we've also got within the original plan was to send crews into the building to rescue people from fire survival guidance and rescue people who may be in the building that they come across. Now it would be actually we're going to send crews to as many flats as we could to search them and rescue people from them. So you've still got the crews inside the building still doing the rescue activity. So you've still got that going on. Control is just a separate part of it where they would now be telling people to leave who were safe. But so the main rescue is still going on from the firefighters entering the building.
But, okay, did you give, having got that stay put change message, did you give any instructions to Richard Welsh and Pat Goulburn at the Bridgehead now to start sending crews up into the building to carry out that mass evacuation? Did you give that instruction?
As incident commander, no. As incident commander, I got the message sent out on the radios that they changed the stay put advice. But when I went out as the operations commander and got a briefing from Richard and Pat of where we were with the operations inside the building, it was still putting a priority in place to who needed to be rescued first. So in some ways, it hadn't changed what we were trying to achieve. You had to identify who you thought was most at risk and try to rescue and evacuate those people first. And so to some effect, the plan was still the same. There was no easy way of sending firefighters into. So I wouldn't have prioritised sending firefighters to an unaffected flat to ask them to leave over sending firefighters to a flat that we know fire survival guidance is going on.
How did you have any thoughts at the time when you received this message as to how exactly you were going to assist all those people to evacuate through the building in circumstances where you had no knowledge or information about the conditions in the lobbies or the stairs?
So it still goes back to the original plan, really, which is that you will prioritise the people in the building based on the north-east side of the building, which is where the fire was at that point in time, not as operations commander, it had spread by then, and the fire survival guidance calls along with the top floors, and then you would do a systematic search of the top floors downwards normally, because that's where likely you're going to get the smoke logging. So to a certain extent, the plan, this change of stay put, doesn't directly change the plan. What it does is, as an impact on the plan, is you can expect people who may have been safe in their flats to now be getting into the staircase and affecting the operations of sending firefighters to fire survival guidance calls.
Okay, did you then, in that short period you had, conceive of or begin to formulate a particular plan as to how you were going to go about that? How you were going to find the BA wearers to get up to those floors, how you were going to brief them, and how you were going to, that they were going to get people out into that stairway, which was going to become increasingly congested.
But to a certain extent, it was still the same rescue and evacuation plan. So we now had 40 fire engines worth of firefighters, so that's around 180 firefighters. We had the 10 FRU, so again, that's about another 50 firefighters. So the plan was to use as many of those BA crews to enter the building, prioritising who they could get to and rescue first. And so it was to put as many breathing apparatus crews into the building to rescue people. So effectively, the plan is the same. We're just having to prioritise who we can get to. And again, you would still go to those you think is most at risk, which in this case was the fire survival guidance calls, rather than send people to unaffected flats.
And what would you do in this plan you've described with all the people coming out of their flats, assuming they could be contacted at all, being able to get across the lobbies and getting into the staircase? What would you do with them while you were rescuing the people who were affected by, who were trapped, who were proper FSG callers?
So is this people so if they're in unaffected flats, so I think what I wouldn't expect the firefighters to do is move someone from an unaffected flat into a more affected environment. So for example, if their lobby outside was full of smoke, I wouldn't expect them to take them from an unaffected flat into a smoke-filled environment. So it was very difficult at that point in time to complete the rescue and evacuation of everyone when you've got still potentially smoke in the lobbies or the staircases. Where people have been directly infected and you need to get them out, then the risk of taking them down the smoke-filled staircase or through a lobby is a risk you have to take because we have no other option.
Forgive me, Mr. Reynolds, I'm a bit confused now. The stay put, as you understood it, was that even though those people, there were people in the building who were not affected by fire, heat or smoke in their flats, they were going to be asked to leave. But are you now saying that actually when firefighters under this plan of yours would get up there and find people in their flats who weren't, they would be told actually to stay in their flats?
They should be asked to leave if they can safely leave. So if they can get into the lobby and they think the staircase is clear and they can leave, then they should leave. But I wouldn't expect, for example, someone who opens their door and finds there's thick smoke outside their front door to then go into that environment. So the stay put change still doesn't mean that people can necessarily just walk out of the building because they have to try to get through the lobby and the staircase out of the building.
Does this mean that just taking occupants of flats that, to your way of thinking, were not yet affected by smoke, fire or heat, the change in stay put meant that they should leave, but under your plan, if it wasn't safe, they should stay? Is that
I think it means yes. So when they phone up control, if they tell control that they can leave safely, in other words, there's no smoke in the lobby and they think they can go down the staircase, then they should try to leave. But if they were speaking to control and saying there was no way to get out of their flat, then effectively they wouldn't be able to leave anyway.
And how would you be able to... What was your plan for getting all these residents, occupants, down that single staircase?
So that's just to use as many firefighters as we could to assist and rescue the casualties and carry them down as they did.
Did you conceive of a systematic way of getting all these BA wearers up into the tower at the same time as evacuating all the occupants?
It was an enormous challenge. So with a single staircase in a building that tight, with firefighters who are carrying large amounts of equipment and going into that staircase, it was very difficult working with the members of the public in there as well.
No, I appreciate
so it was an enormous challenge, and I suppose there's no easy answer to how we do that. You send as many firefighters as you can. They're experienced in high-rise fires, and they would carry out the tasks as best they can. But in the single staircase, as compromised as this became, it became a big challenge, yes. But we've probably moved on to when I was operations commander at that point.
Well, that brings me to this question. We've talked a lot about the plans, really in the abstract. My question is, in that moment when you were told that the stay put had changed and understood and clarified how it had changed, did you actually conceive a formulated plan as to how you were going to go about it? Did you actually sit down and go, right, I need so many BA wearers, I need to do it this floor by that floor? Or
so
what did you do?
In some ways, the plan still hadn't changed. So I didn't feel we had a shortage of BA wearers. I think I probably had certainly more than 200, perhaps 250 BA wearers available to me at that point in time. I couldn't physically fit 250 BA wearers in the building, so I knew I had enough BA wearers for a considerable period of time. The plan was still to prioritise those people in the building, so the fire survival guidance schools and the people on the north-east side of the building who are most likely to be affected, followed by the people on the upper floors, and then working systematically through the building. So the change of stay put is that if people feel they can escape, then they should try to, but it's not, I don't think it's trying to tell people to go into a smoke-filled environment. It's saying if you feel you can escape, you should. But I wasn't then sending firefighters to, or wasn't planning to send firefighters to people in unaffected flats over sending firefighters to flats that were directly affected and, in immediate danger, if you like, from a fire survival guidance school. But there was a limit to what you could do in an amount of time.
Now, can I ask you to go, please, to page 18 of your statement, where you say at the top of the page, in the third line, I knew this decision, this is the change in stay put, would have an impact on the FSG and the fire sectors as it would change their priorities and mean that people would be moving around inside the building and not be in places we previously thought. So I asked for a message to be sent to each sector. Who did you ask?
The comms operator, who I don't think was Dan by that point. It would have been the person who took over from Dan.
Right. Did you see or hear the comms operator send that message?
No, I wouldn't have done.
Right. Did you check that it had been sent?
I wouldn't have done. I wouldn't have had the time to.
Right. Now, you refer to changing priorities there. It just comes back to a point I just wanted to pursue with you, arising out of what you said a moment ago. How would you expect those sectors, FSG and fire, to change their priorities? What did you expect them to do?
So I think probably try and change their priorities, change what they're trying to achieve. So it just means that the people may not be where they were expecting them to be. So if you're now pushing and encouraging people who are trapped, so fire survival guidance calls, even more to get out, they could end up not being in the flats that you thought they were in. So they may try leaving a flat and still end up in a smoke-filled environment and end up somewhere else. So they're not where you thought they'd be initially. People who should be told to leave, which they should have always been, they could end up, so that doesn't change those. What it does change is people who are staying in their flats may actually, if they end up in the lobbies and staircases, if crews come across those people when they are going in, they are most likely to try to rescue them. So where you've sent a crew into a particular fire survival guidance call on a particular floor, if they come across people who are within the staircase or the lobbies who they feel need rescue, they would have to, most likely, they would have to stop the rescue they were tasked to and carry out a different rescue. Did
you think all that at the time?
In that minute, probably not, no. But as operations commander, it was what evolved, if you like, was that it could have had a material impact on what happened.
Yes, I can see that's how it might have evolved. And but in that moment, my question is, at the time, when you say it would change their priorities, did you have any thoughts about how those priorities would change, and in practice, how the Bridgehead would reconfigure things?
I think in particular, it's going to mean that there's potentially more people coming into the staircase. And if there's more people coming into the staircase, that will affect the firefighters who are going in to carry out the rescues for the fire survival guidance call. So they would have to either assist or escort some of those people out, or make sure those people are getting out safely. So the risk is that you've got people who are in safe flats are now going into the staircase,
yes,
and those people now become the priority because they're now within the staircase, and we have to get those out. And the crews are having to be retasked from what they were trying to achieve of reaching fast survival guidance calls on the other floors.
Did you get as far as formulating a plan as to how to carry out those priorities so that those people who were trapped would still be treated as a priority as they had been before?
So probably from this to the information coming in on the fast survival guidance call numbers to Andy taking over was about 3 minutes. So right. I wouldn't say I'd reviewed the entire plan of what we were going to achieve. I handed it over to Andy and told him what the plan was we had in place at the moment. And then as operations commander, I spoke with Richard and Pat about how we were carrying it out, but that was as operations commander.
So do I understand your evidence really to be this? Is this right? That the effect of the change in the stay put meant that the priorities changed, so the FSG callers who were trapped would no longer be treated as the priority because people in the staircase would now be rescued instead?
Sir, I'm so sorry. I'm always hesitant, right? And rarely do, but Mr. Millett is given to putting to a witness whether it is fair to summarise in a particular way. And often, the way in which that has just been put doesn't bear any relation to the evidence that's been given. So I'm just asking for some fairness to the witness.
Well,
conscious of the time.
actually, if you look at the transcript, what I think the witness is being asked about is the effect of what he was describing on the order in which people would receive help from the firefighters.
Yes.
And I think the point that the witness is being asked to deal with is, would the influx of people previously safe into the staircase, where they may become in need of assistance from firefighters, detract firefighters from going to the flats where people were known to be trapped by the fire and smoke? And is that not a fair point?
Put in that way, it is indeed a fair point.
Well, have a look at the transcript. It's not awfully different from what Mr. Millett put.
Well,
but anyway, perhaps the way forward is to invite you to comment on my reformulation of the question.
I think so. It wouldn't have changed their priorities. Their priority was still the fire survival guidance calls and the people on the northeast corner. What changes is the firefighters who've been tasked to go and carry out those rescues may have to go to do a different task because they meet people in the staircase.
Well, I think that's really the point Mr. Millett was inviting you to deal with, that the practical effect of the change in the advice could be, maybe was, this is where perhaps you can help, to divert firefighters who've been tasked to go to known flats where people were trapped into rescuing people who'd come from a relative place of safety, or place of relative safety, into the stairwell.
Yes, so the firefighters who've been tasked to go to a fire survival guidance call, which is the highest risk, then not through retasking through the entry control or the fire sector, but on the way into the building, then come across people that they feel in the staircase or lobbies need to be rescued or helped to evacuate. And so rather than carrying out their original task, they end up doing a different task.
Yeah, and I think some of those who've already given us evidence have described that situation arising. Yeah. On you go, Mr. Millett.
I think I've probably squeezed that lemon dry. Thank you very much, Mr. O'Loughlin.
Thank you.
I'm grateful to the chairman and, as always, to Mr. Walsh. Can I move then to the handover with Andy Rowe? On page 18 of your statement, you say, and this is 2/3 of the way down, we'd started to fill in the headline board and had started recording the FSG numbers and priorities when AC Andy Rowe arrived just minutes later. The first thing he said to me was that we needed to change the stay put advice. I informed him that that decision had already been taken by Adrian Fenton and had put in place by control. What was his response? Did he respond to that?
I can't remember if he responded to that. Well, I think he acknowledged it, most likely. So he asked if he needed to change it. I said it had already been changed and he acknowledged that. I very quickly then led him to the FSG numbers that I'd written up on the wall, because they were my priority.
Okay. Now, just in terms of timing, if I could just pin this down with some precision, if you go to the short incident log at page 23, please. You can see there 024418, just after your message at 024250 about 58 adults and 16 children, you see just below it, CUA, AC row is now IC, Incident Commander. Does that accord with your recollection as to when he arrived and became a
It was very quickly
commander?
after I got that information about the 58 adults and 16 children.
Okay. Now, going back to the passage in page 18 of your statement, you say that he acknowledged the decision had been made. Did he tell you that the decision was one for him as Incident Commander, or was he happy that it had been made by Control?
It wasn't that detailed. So when he got on the unit, he said something along the lines of, we need to change the stay put advice.
Right.
And I said, Control's already changed that.
Okay.
And then I said, this is where we need to look, and this is because that had just come to me, that information, and that number was so high that I knew that needed to be the priority we were focusing on.
Was Group Manager Steve West on the command unit at that point?
I think he was, because I think I tasked Steve West to finish off the methane message, as well as asking him to take the role of Sector Commander Command Support. So he was. Yes, he was, because I briefed him to take Sector Commander Command Support, but I'd said to him I didn't have a unit for him at that point, so stay on the unit and do what he could there before we found a unit for him, and then also to do the methane message. So he should have been in or around the unit at some point.
Was he involved in the discussion about changing the stay put advice? Do you know?
Not that I recall. Because I'd given him Sector Commander Command Support, one of the roles is to oversee the command units and how the command units operate.
Right.
So it's possible that he was in the discussion with the watch manager who spoke to Control, but he would have been there and around, but I can't recall.
Right. My question, perhaps more pertinently, was Steve West involved in any discussion between Control and Andy Rowe that you saw about stay put?
Not that I saw, no.
Okay. Did you ask Andy Rowe what he knew or what was driving his decision that he made that stay put should be changed?
No, I didn't, no.
Okay. Now, you describe the handover. You say that he informed me that he was taking over, 4 lines down from that start of that paragraph, and you say, I briefed him on the FSG numbers and the estimated number of those still inside the building. And I'll just put this to you. Was that the 58 adults and 16 children, which was just the subject of the message you'd sent moments before?
No, so the 58 adults and 16 children was the FSG numbers.
Yes.
My estimated number of those inside the building would have been the original. It's a high-rise building. It's going to be somewhere between 100 and 200 people,
yeah.
And so you can take those people out of that number and still identify a number possibly over 100.
Yes.
That is still involved in the building.
And you say that you described to him what I'd seen during my visit to the tower and detailed my sectors and their commanders. Now, that visit to the tower, is that the visit to the southeast corner of the tower where you
That's
took
the only time
handover?
until that point that I'd been to the tower, yes.
The handover from Andy Walton?
Yes.
Yes. And you detailed your sectors and their commanders. And then you told him what the makeups were. And then you say, over the page, that he asked you to perform the role of sector commander coordinator.
No, he assigned me to operations commander. So with operations commanders, there's a number of ways you can carry out. One is that you end up with your own command unit, almost like another incident commander, if you like. And then the original incident commander takes a sort of higher role. Right. I wanted to be out on the fire ground, and so the operations commander role came in probably 12 to 15 years ago, and before that was a similar role called sector commander coordinator. Right. And it just meant you were much more on the fire ground and go in between the sectors operationally.
Okay.
So it's virtually no difference. It's just that I think our understanding was where I wanted to be was physically on the fire ground and not within a unit. And I think by explaining it as sector commander coordinator, Andy would have understood that, and I understood it. It meant I want to be on the fire ground, not, if you like, tied onto a unit.
Yes.
But it's still the operations commander. I was still the operations commander.
Apart from telling him about the FSG numbers, 58 adults, 16 children, and the estimated number of those inside the building, 1 to 200, as you clarified for us, and the makeups, as you explained there, and your sectorisation, was there any other information that you gave him about what was actually happening on the incident ground?
So I would have told him what my understanding of the fire was, but I would have said it was from quite some time ago, because I've not had a briefing from the fire sector for some time. I then would have detailed that the FSG unit had been set up and that was taking calls, and that was where that information had just come from regarding the number of fire survival guidance calls. But again, I hadn't had an update from that for some time. And then would have run through the hazards that I am aware of at the incident, which was primarily the debris falling and the fire itself. We would have briefly covered gas and electric because they would have been involved at some point in the building, but that's normal for a fire. Right. And then we would have gone on to the structures and the priorities and the resources that I had in place.
Did you tell him that you had not had any information back from the fire sector or the FSG sector for 25 minutes or so? I
wouldn't have told him 25 minutes. I would have said some time.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you
I might have even said from the start of being here. I would have made clear that I've not had an update for a considerable amount of time. Or 25 minutes.
What did he say to that, if anything?
I think he would have acknowledged it. I think Andy also would understand that when you've got fires that are particularly dynamic, and this one was extremely so, the officers you've sent out are so busy doing the tasks that you've given them, they're not getting the time to get information back to you. And so he would have, and he's probably been to incidents where that happens, and that's where you try and chase up information through your comms team or sending other officers out. So Andy would have understood that that was happening, and that's why I wanted to get out onto the fire ground and find out where we were and what the status was.
To the best of your knowledge, from what you could see and divine from what he was saying, what did he know about the extent of the fire spread and the development of smoke spread within the building?
I think which way around we would have led it, I'm not sure, but I'd asked everyone who got on if they'd seen the fire, because obviously just seeing it told you a lot.
Yes.
And I'm certain Andy had seen it, but I don't know if that was him telling me he'd seen it or I asked him. But he hadn't been to the tower, or that's not the impression he gave me. I think he'd seen it similar to what I had from a distance. And then I'd gone to the tower. Obviously, I don't think he'd had that opportunity yet, so he'd just seen it from a distance like all the officers actually arriving had.
Okay. I'd like now to turn to your role as operations commander or sector commander coordinator. In terms of the timing of that briefing, we can see from Andy Rowe's log, we can just turn to that, that you were briefed at 02:54. Can I just ask you to look at his log, which is MET quadruple 05404, and we'll be looking at this in some detail, this document, so we'll come back to it. I've called it the Rowe log for shorthand, so everybody knows what we're talking about. But just so you're clear, this is a document created by, we think, Jackie McConaughey, who was Andy Rowe's logist, based on Andy Rowe's who was there at these meetings. Now, can I ask you first of all, please, to look at 0254, which is the second entry. Sorry, first entry, 0247. AC Rowe takes over and receives handover from DAC O'Loughlin. And then it talks about the decision to deviate from FSG advice. And then it says this: fire sector is briefed to that effect. Do you recall how the fire sector was briefed to that effect? So I'd asked for the fire sector to be told when I found the information out 3 or 4 minutes earlier through the comms officer. Okay. So I don't know if that was me telling Andy that a message had been sent out, or if that's an additional action that Andy's taken. Right. So it's possible that's an additional action, or it's the same action. I don't know which one it is. Okay. Then it goes on to say, 0254, AC Rowe briefs DAC O'Loughlin as operations commander with responsibility for fire and FSG. First priority is to establish access and egress. Does that sound right to you, as a summary of the briefing?
Certainly the operations commander with the responsibility part. I also had the outside of the building, so the surrounding area.
Right.
The first priority being the access and egress doesn't ring any bells. I'm not sure if that means access and egress to the overall incident, which wouldn't have been mine because that would be command support, or access and egress to the building. But at that point, we were still using the south entry, and there was no issue for the access and egress. So I'm not sure about the access and egress part.
Okay. Then in the next line it says 0255, so only a minute later. Command Channel 2 is to be established, and a quick and dirty tactical coordination meeting to be held with police at the earliest opportunity. Were you still on the CU and AC Rowe was talking about setting up Command Channel 2? Do you recall?
I expect I probably would. I told him that the comms were not working very well. Channel 2 is what we'd want to use, but to do that you need the command unit team to set it up for you.
Right.
So in the time that I was in charge, I didn't have anyone available to do that. So when Darren Merrick, for example, was so busy, I couldn't have asked him to stop what he was doing and set up Command Channel 2.
Right. If you go back then to page 19 of your statement, where we were before, and I think you covered this, but you say 4 lines down that you understood you had command of the operational side of the incident. And in the next sentence you say, so I had the fire sector with Richard Welsh and Pat Goulbourne on the inside of the building, the outside of the tower, and the FSG unit. That was your total field of command. Were you then responsible back to Andy Rowe as to what was happening within each of those sectors?
Yes, that's the role of the operations.
Right. And you say in that sentence that you were responsible for tactical decision-making therein. Does that mean that you were responsible for the tactical decision-making in each of those sectors? So inside the building, outside the building, and the FSG unit?
Yes, it does. So the incident commander will give you an overall aim of what they're trying to achieve, and then you will take that objective, if you like, and to put the tactical decisions into place to achieve that. And then you won't change the objectives of what the incident commander wants to achieve, but you'll use the tactics that you need to make those objectives achievable. And if at any point you're unable to, you can go back to the incident commander and clarify that you're not able to achieve his objectives, and you can put in different tactics. Okay,
well, we'll come back to each of those sectors in turn. Before I do that, can I just ask you to look at policy 432, which is in our policy bundle. It's LFB 50170. And I'd like you to go, please, to page 4, responsibilities. That's appendix 1. If we can just go to responsibilities, which I think probably page 3. I'm sorry, it's my fault. Page 5. Now, looking at item 1, information about task or event, it says operations commander should ensure the following. Information about task or event. Establish and maintain information regarding the number of casualties involved within each sector, the tactical mode of each of the sectors, the development of progress and progress of operational tactics, and the effect of incident and fire service operations to the surrounding environment. Did you discuss each or any of those with Andy Rowe on taking the role of operations commander?
So we definitely discussed the number of casualties. So that was the fire survival guidance calls and the others that were put in the building. Tactical mode, it was Oscar, which meant the whole building was what we call offensive mode, and it means effectively that you're inside the building trying to carry out rescues.
As opposed to...
So there's 2 other modes. Defensive means that you have... so if you can think of something like a warehouse that's burning down, there's no chance of it being saved, you would, and it's too risky to put firefighters into it. The defensive mode is that you kind of stand back from it and perhaps use aerial appliances to put the fire out. So it would mean that you're not trying to affect internal firefighting and or firefighting, put breathing apparatus in. It means that you've decided that risk outweighs the benefit to actually putting firefighters at risk. So you'd be outside a hazard zone effectively. It was tactical mode Oscar for the whole incident, which means every sector is operationally, involved inside trying to rescue, etc.
Right. And did you discuss with Andy Rowe what the overall objectives of your task were to be?
Yep. So I outlined in my plan, and it's a 2-way discussion. That my objectives at that point were the fire survival guidance calls, and that we were trying to get to those first, the northeast side of the building, and then systematically the other floors within the building.
Right.
And as far as I recall, Andy agreed with what that was, and that continued as the operational plan.
Okay. Now, turning first to the FSG sector, on page 19 of your statement, halfway down the page, you say, I got onto the FSG unit and Tom Goodall was on there. How long after AC Rowe arrived at CU8 did you leave to go to the FSG unit?
Could you repeat the question, sorry?
Yes, how long after Andy Rowe arrived on CU8 did you leave to go to the FSG unit, which was CU7?
We probably had quite a detailed brief, so I expect it was at least 5 minutes, probably closer to 7 to 10 minutes. There was a lot for me to hand over to him. Okay. I also knew once I'd left Andy, I wasn't likely to see him again for half an hour to an hour, because he would be tied up on the command unit and I'd be tied up in operations. So I remember trying to hand over everything that I knew and the plan that I put in place, which takes some time, and then for Andy to confirm my role. So I'd say it was a minimum 5 minutes and probably up to 10 minutes. And somewhere in between that is probably the more likely time.
Were you on CU8 when a positive pressure ventilation system was requested by the duty DAC?
By the duty DAC? No, the duty DAC wouldn't be on the command unit.
But it's something recorded in Andy Leroux's log at 2:57. So do you have any recollection of that?
I don't have a recollection of it, but if Andy asked for it, it would have been a single sentence to an officer on there, so it's probably something I wouldn't have even noticed. But he may have been. I can't recall it.
Now, you say in your statement, 3 lines down from where we just were, this is halfway down page 19, I asked him what structure they had in place, and he directed me to a table on the whiteboard. This later grew to a much larger table, which I subsequently photographed. Did Tom Goodall explain to you what the chain of communication of FSG information was at that moment from the command unit to the Bridgehead?
It was runners.
It was
I think
runners.
They were trying to use the radios as well, but the radios that I could tell were still too busy, so it was predominantly runners. I think he might have even named some, but I can't recall the names.
Did you see the runners yourself?
No, I mean, you're seeing firefighters moving back and forth between the building. I mean, they're not literally running. So I saw a number of firefighters, and during the night I became aware that Pete Wolfenden was doing it, and a number of others. But I saw firefighters going back and forth from the FSG unit to the building.
Do you remember what they were taking with them? Pieces of paper?
I can't recall the pieces of paper, but I have no doubt there was pieces of paper. You wouldn't try to memorise it, so you would write things down. So the expectation would be that it's been written down on the command unit, the CU7, and then it's been handed over to a runner to take into the building. So I don't recall pieces of paper being seen, but I have no doubt they were there.
Right. Okay. Mr. Chairman, we've been going for more than an hour, and I'm conscious that it's tiring work for all of us. Perhaps a short break now may be appropriate.
Yes. How are you getting on with yours?
A little bit slower than I would have hoped this morning, but I'm going to I'm going to try and speed up if I can.
All right. Well, we'll have a 10-minute break now, Mr. Recollection. Please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while they're out of the room. And we'll come back at 11:45, please.
Thank you.
All right. I'd like to go to the usher. Thank you. Course to 11, then, please. Right, Mr. O'Loughlin, ready to carry on?
Yes, sir.
Good, thank you.
Mr. O'Loughlin, thank you for coming back to us. Can I just revisit one or two aspects of the discussion we were having this morning very helpfully about the change to the stay put advice and its effect, particularly in terms of prioritisation? Am I right in thinking, and correct me if this is wrong, because I don't want to put something to you that's unfair, but do I understand it that your understanding was that the revoking of the stay put advice affected the unaffected flats, so that people who were, to your way of thinking, in flats which weren't affected at that time by fire, heat or smoke would now have to get out?
Yes, it would be, because the first message that came to me was that they changed the stay put advice.
Yeah.
And for me, that only applies to the people in unaffected flats.
Yeah.
And then the second phone call was that message saying, talking about fire survival guidance calls in the same, within the same context, if you like. So for me, it felt like they included all.
Did you have any understanding of how many flats were in fact unaffected, which would now be producing all their occupants?
Not for definite, no. So my understanding at that point, obviously I'd not seen the fire for a while, was it was the northeast side of the building that was affected, so that would be probably a quarter of the flats.
Right.
And so you've got 3/4 that potentially aren't. You'd have to take some of those out for perhaps the top floors where there's smoke logging.
Right.
But you could look at the southwest side, for example, I would expect to be unaffected. And potentially the northeast and northwest sides to also potentially be unaffected.
Did you think...
So quite a lot of flats potentially.
Quite a lot of flats potentially. And the last information you had was when you'd seen the fire for yourself. Did you think to yourself at the time that the fire might have spread from the northeast corner, as you call it, elsewhere? In the 25 or 30 minutes since you were out on the incident ground?
There's always a risk that the fire can spread, and that's why I required the updates. Or it could be that the fire within the flats has got worse. So it's always got the potential, and one thing you'd get is as much information you can to try and establish that.
On what you did know about the detail of FSGs, did you realise that FSG calls were coming from right across the tower, from floors 9 up, right up to floor 23?
No, I picked up some of the floor numbers on the way in originally, and I understood there was a large number of them, but I didn't know on the specific floors at that point in time, no.
But by that stage, that was 45 minutes prior to that.
Yeah, and I'd asked the fire survival guidance coordinator to establish exactly how many flats were involved and where they were.
So is the answer to my question that at that stage, when the stay put was changed, you didn't realise or didn't know that FSGs were coming in from right across the tower, from 9th floor up to 23rd floor?
I knew that there were FSGs coming in throughout the tower, yes, because I'd heard the different floor numbers, and I think early on I'd heard some high floor numbers. And in addition to that, I mentioned in some of the calls I'd heard originally, they weren't FSG calls, they were calls saying there was smoke on this floor or smoke on that floor, if I recall correctly.
Did you know that they were coming from all sides of the building and not just the northeast side?
No, I did not.
Right. Did you take any steps to find out whether that was the case?
That was the information I wanted from the fire survival guidance unit, which was where are the affected flats and what flats are affected. So that's the information I would expect to get back from that.
Standing back and looking at the effect of the change in stay put that Adrian Fenton had told you had been the subject of Decision Act control, did it occur to you at that stage, on the basis of that information, that compartmentation had failed throughout the building?
No, it wouldn't occur to me that compartmentations failed throughout the building. That's not something I'd experienced before and not something I would have expected. So, again, it would come back to if we talk about the internal compartmentation, it would be normally that people would leave their doors open when they try to escape, and that would take your compartmentation away. I wouldn't expect failure of the internal compartmentation because that's not something I'd experienced on any scale like this.
Well, let me try the question in a slightly different way round. Did the fact that stay put was being changed so that even people who were in clean air in their flats were being told to leave, did that not mean to you that compartmentation had failed throughout the building or was failing throughout the building?
No, I wouldn't say it still meant to me that compartmentation was failing. What it meant was that between control and the FSG unit, they had information that told them that it was to tell some people to leave the building, and that they must have known that the people could leave the building potentially safely. So but not compartmentation to fail. That wouldn't have told me that compartmentation was failing.
So to your way of thinking, given that the advice was now to tell people even who are unaffected in their flats to leave, given that, What was it, to your way of understanding, that meant they were in danger and had to leave?
Well, everyone within the building, I would expect we were going to rescue or evacuate. So it's almost a continuation of that plan. It's just bringing it, I wouldn't say it's bringing it forward, it's getting some of those people out when I couldn't be assured that they were going to be able to get out through a non-smoke-filled environment.
But, sorry, let me just press this. Maybe I didn't ask the question very well. Taking a person who was in a flat, in clean air, not affected by fire, heat or smoke, what had changed structurally in the building, or physically in the building, that meant that it was no longer safe for them to stay in their flats?
Nothing to my awareness. Nothing had changed in that building from the time I'd seen it from the outside.
So what was the logic, to your way of understanding, of asking them to leave their flats?
So I didn't understand the reasoning behind it. My expectation is, between the conversations they've had with the unit and control, is that they acknowledge that you've got long travel distances, that it will be difficult for our firefighters to get to everyone in the building, and if people feel they can leave safely, then they could be encouraged to do so. Because the important bit to stay put is they've got to be able to leave safely still. You wouldn't expect them to go into a smoke-filled environment. So they may have more information than I have at that point in time, that people may be able to leave their flats safely.
Did you ask yourself, or indeed anyone at control, what had changed so as to prompt the change in the stay put advice?
No, I didn't have the time to do that.
Right. Did you ask yourself or control why that decision wasn't made at an earlier stage?
I didn't have the time to do that, no. So within probably 3-4 minutes, I'd hand it over to Andy.
On what you knew at that stage, do you think that the advice should have been changed, or did you think that the advice should have been changed at an earlier time?
I think for the people who are within their flats, and I haven't yet had the chance to assess whether it's safe for them to leave, until we know that there's a lower risk for them to leave their flats, then the opportunity wasn't there to change the advice. And also there's no mechanism to pass that advice on. So other than the people phoning control, there's no mechanism for me to tell people within that building who are not phoning control they should leave, other than sending firefighters to their flat doors. And at that point in time, the priority was send the firefighters to the fire survival guidance course. On
what you later discovered during the course of the night, do you accept that the advice to leave should have been changed at a much earlier stage?
Earlier in the night, when I was incident commander, you mean?
Well, on what you later discovered during the course of the night, do you accept that the advice to leave, the stay-put advice, I should say, should have been changed at an earlier stage?
No, I think the stay-put advice, for the conditions we were dealing with when I was incident commander and aware of, stay-put should have stayed, people should have been safe in their flats. You wouldn't expect the fire to have spread around the building like it did on the outside, and for it to fail so catastrophically. Right. We'd never expected or anticipate that would do that in the way it did. And then similarly, as you mentioned, we would not expect the internal protection to fail so badly as well. So my expectation with people who are safe in their flats should stay safe on their flats, and the southwest side would be an example of that. There's no reason to believe that people on the southwest side of that building should have been affected.
At the time, but let me put the question again. On what you later discovered during the course of the night, do you accept that the revocation of the stay-put advice should have happened at an earlier stage than it did?
I don't think you could say that a decision could be taken earlier based on what I saw several hours later. I mean, the building was so horrendous several hours later that I think no one should have lived in the building. But so I think to say that we should have changed the stay-put advice, I don't think would have been reasonable based on something that happened several hours later that none of us could have ever expected.
Right. Now, going back to your taking command of the FSG, you say, going back to page 19 of your statement, halfway down the page, halfway down the paragraph which starts, I got onto the FSG unit, you say, Tom confirmed that they were prioritising calls and sending this information on paper to the fire sector using runners. They'd already set up a direct line to control solely to deal with FSGs. That direct line, did you see it in operation?
Yeah, it was one of the officers. I think it was possibly Dan Merrick with a mobile phone, so it was probably Dan when he went across.
And do you know who he was speaking to at control?
No, it would have been someone within control.
Right. And did anybody tell you, did Tom Goodall tell you what lines of communication had been set up to send messages from control to the command unit?
From control to the command unit? Is that not the same? So do you mean the FSG unit, or do you mean...
Yes.
It's the the phone call that Dan Merrick's making.
Yeah, okay, but did he give you an impression of any other methods of communication, such as radio or?
Not that I recall. No, I said, have you something like, are you speaking with control, or we got contact with control? And he pointed to an officer, which I think was Dan Merrick, who was on a mobile phone and said something like, he's got a two-way conversation going with control.
Right. So it was just that single.
That's all I recall.
That single link.
They've still got the fireground radio available. That would still be on. So there may be someone manning that. But the point was, he said that I've got a two-way conversation going on between him and control. I didn't explore it any further, and he didn't. Tell me any more.
You say that Tom confirmed they were prioritising calls. Did you understand on what basis Tom and his crew were prioritising calls?
So at that point in time, that's when they had the list rather than the table. And I think it was just subjective based on what was coming into the unit and the information they were getting and the risk they thought people were at.
Right. Did you form a view about what system they were using to prioritise?
I'd probably never been in a situation where I thought we would have to prioritise individual fire survival guidance calls. So I accepted that what they were doing was based on the information that they were receiving. In their judgment, who was most at risk, they were saying they were the ones that were the priority. But I'd never considered a position where we would have so many fire survival guidance calls in progress that we would have to put one fire survival guidance call above another, and that had never occurred to me that we'd have to do that.
Okay. Did you find out what system they were using to prioritise calls?
I can't recall if I had the conversation. It would have been based on risk, but I can't recall if I did.
But you say based on risk. What does that mean?
Who you think is most at risk in that point in time.
Right.
And it would become subjective. It would become based on what the fire survival guidance team are receiving and what control is telling them.
Yeah.
It's actually an incredibly difficult task. There is no easy way for them to do that.
You say based on risk. Did you get to understand of any individual given call what factors meant that they were given a priority over other calls?
Not at that point in time, no. But later on, when they did the table, they'd attempted even more to try and break the table down into specific numbers of people involved, and or I think where they put P's on, I think it was to do with if the person was getting more and more affected. It was something along those lines. So it's based on how all of them obviously were at risk. It was just subjective, their thoughts about who they thought was most at risk.
Yeah, but as commander, did you not take any steps to satisfy yourself that the way they were going about prioritising these calls was appropriate?
So that was later on, though. So yes, when I went back to so separating the two out, the information. So priorities on the FSG unit was based on the information they were getting from control on who they thought was most at risk, which was in effect all of them, and then they had to somehow break those down into who they thought was most immediate risk. And they'd set up a table to show who they were, including the numbers involved and the children. To break it down further into individual elements, I don't think we could have done. I don't think it's something we'd expected we'd ever had to do. And so I knew they put priorities in place based on their view of the information they were getting from control about those calls.
Well, at that stage, I'm just looking at that stage, when you say Tom confirmed they were prioritising calls. What I'm seeking to get a feel for is whether you got an understanding of precisely what the factors were, the ingredients in any given call, age, disability,
At that point in time, when I went onto that unit, this is when I first took over Operations Commander, I only had a brief conversation with Tom to make sure that they'd set up their systems, as in communications with control, that they had a way of identifying the FSGs, which was the list they were producing, that they had a way of communicating with the fire sector, which was the runners. And I think I also asked him about resources, and he said he had enough at that point. I think there were 6 of them on there.
Right.
And I actually left them to carry on. What I needed to get to at that point was the fire sector. So I didn't go into detail with Tom at that point about how they were going to prioritise those fire survival guidance calls. At that point, I think they were treating them all as the priority. And later on, they'd have to somehow put a priority on the priority calls, which was an incredibly challenging task. But at that point in time, it was a fairly short discussion with Tom to see if he needed anything more for the FSG unit, if the systems had been set up to make the system work effectively.
But didn't you need to understand how calls were being prioritised subjectively? In other words, what their subjective thinking was as to who they would treat as a priority, so that when you did get to the fire sector, you would know and be able to quality assure that those priorities were actually being carried out through deployments from the Bridgehead?
So at that point in time, I don't believe they'd had the chance to prioritise the fire survival guidance calls individually. I think at that point, the fire survival guidance calls were all treated as the priority, and they were all being passed across to the fire sector. For me to have got on to the unit and with Tom break down those calls and establish how we were going to prioritise them at that point, I think I would have got tied into the FSG unit when I knew I needed to go into the tower and establish where we were with firefighting and rescue.
But you say in your statement that Tom confirmed they were prioritising calls. Maybe I've misunderstood your answer.
Priority calls are the FSG calls. So the FSG calls are the priority. So he's got other information coming into him, and there may be other sources, but the priority calls were FSG calls. And at that point in time, there wasn't the time or the opportunity to break those individual FSG calls down into one being more important than another.
So did you think that CU7 was receiving calls from control which were not FSG calls?
They may have been. I think they were coordinating all the information they had. So my expectation was any information that they've got from any of the calls would be going to the FSG unit, and they were coordinating all of it. I think even by this time, some people had gone up to them, walked up to the unit, and so they were. In fact, they had walked up to the unit, because during my time as incident commander, I'd had 2 people come up to me with telephones. So they were getting information from more places than just control.
Right.
And of course, those calls wouldn't have been fire survival guidance calls. They were members of the public talking to their families inside the flats.
Right. Can I ask you to be shown, please, MET 000015930? Does this look familiar to you?
So I saw a list. So when I was talking to Tom, there was a list behind him, what he pointed to, which is most likely to be that. But I didn't look at that in the detail of it. That's the sort of thing it was, though. So I expect that is the list.
Right. Now, we have a time mark for that photograph of 2:59.
Okay.
Would that be about the time that you would have got onto CU7 and seen that?
I don't know if that's the time I got on the CU7. I mean, I accept that's the time the photograph was taken. But
if that's right, if that's right, and that's the time at which that photograph was taken, does that not tell us that does that not show the breakdown of individual occupants of flats, at least to enable people to be prioritised?
It shows the breakdown of individuals in the flats. I'm not sure it gives you enough information to then prioritise those. So to take each one of those flats and work out if one flat has to be rescued before another flat is an incredibly challenging task. It's not something I'd considered we'd ever have to put in place before. And so by that point in time, I think they were treating all of those calls as priorities. When they got the opportunity to do the bigger table, they then tried to put a priority on those individual calls, which in itself was incredibly difficult.
Now, did you get a chance to quality assure the lines of communication from Command Unit 7 to the incident ground, to the tower?
It was runners, and I saw people going back and forth.
Right.
They may well have had pieces of paper. I don't recall looking at pieces of paper, but there was definitely, throughout the night, junior officers and officers going back and forth from the command unit to the tower.
In your role as operations commander in charge of this sector, FSG, did you do anything to make sure, even by spot checking, that an FSG call, a piece of information about a particular flat, got from the command unit to the Bridgehead?
So different flats, so when they got the table up, so this was later on, I questioned Tom on some of the individual flats, particularly the ones that had high numbers of people involved. So I think one of them had 10 people involved. And I remember asking how we knew that was so many people.
Yeah.
I'm not sure Tom was certain if it was one family or if others had all collected together, because I think by that point there was the possibility that people were moving into each other's flats, and Tom had said people seemed to be moving around. So I can't recall if that one in particular, but I did that with a few flats, and then when I think I got over to the tower, they had a different layout for the way they were listing things, but the information was there, or it seemed to be there, that they had a system in place to record it, and it seemed the same. Alongside that, I checked in with the 2 ORT officers, so Matt Cook and Mick Mulholland, particularly Matt Cook, about, does the system for FSG seem to be working? And he was assured that the information was getting across, and it seemed to be getting across accurately.
Right, but did you do anything yourself, personally, to track a single, or perhaps an example lot of FSG calls on their route from CU7 to the Bridgehead, to the point of deployment? I
was tracking the process insofar I was checking that the FSG calls that were written up on the unit were being communicated into the search coordinator within the building. And
how are you doing that? How are you checking?
By physically looking at the wall. I wasn't checking off all the numbers, so I wasn't checking every flat number that was listed in CU7 against every flat number that Glyn had up. What I could see was that officers were taking information across from CU7, passing it across to the search coordinator who was writing that information up. I wasn't cross-checking individual flat numbers. That's not something I would have got into. Clearly the system was working and there was no reason to think that they would be writing up the wrong numbers, for example. And then it was getting from the search coordinator to the fire sector commander and to the bridgehead.
That
was the process they were following.
You say clearly the system was working. There was no reason why they wouldn't have written up the wrong number. To what extent, when you say the systems were working, were you making assumptions?
It's not an assumption. I think it's not realistic that I'd be able to check. So for me to have checked them all individually, I'd have had to write all the numbers down myself. So I'd have had to copy it and then go across to the building and then read it against the wall. I think what you look to see is if the system you've put in place to works effectively. There's no reason for me to think that a flat number would be written up wrongly when it's taken from one unit into the building. It's not something I would expect to go wrong. The process and the system we had in place seemed to be working, and there was no feedback that it wasn't working.
Let me just ask you this in a different way. Did you at any stage check that the system, as you described it, was working by taking a sample flat on the most up-to-date FSG information, looking at the grid or wall in CU7, following that information down to the tower, into the bridgehead, to the point of deployment of a crew to respond to that call? Did you check?
No, that's not something I would have expected me to do, and I didn't do that, no.
You say you wouldn't have expected to do it, but was that not your job as operations commander, even on a spot check basis, to ensure that that line of communication was operating from A to Z?
My job was to make sure the structure and the system was in place and to make sure it was working. I don't think it was my role to then take an individual flat number and try and follow it through that route. So I don't think that's not what I did, and that's not what I would have expected me to do.
So you say your responsibility was to make sure that it was working. What did you do, actually functionally do, to make sure that it was working?
So I could see that the information from control was coming in via the telephone and or radios, and it was getting written up on the board within the FSG unit.
Right.
And that information was going via runners across to the building, most likely a piece of paper, I can't recall the piece of paper, and that was then being put onto the building, the table they'd written up within the lobby area, and then from the lobby area it was going via the fire sector to the bridgehead. So I checked that process was working and that they were all communicating with each other and they understood their roles and how it was working together. But what I didn't do was take a flat number and then go through a process of looking at the flat numbers in that chain.
Okay. Now, we'll come back to that line of communication in a moment. Do you know who was writing the information up on the wall in the lobby?
I think it was Glyn Williams. Well, Glyn Williams was certainly overseeing it. If he was doing all the writing himself, I'm not sure, but he was definitely there.
Can I ask you to look at MET 0005774? This is the white wall on the left of the lobby as you go in. Did you see this wall being inscribed in this way?
Is that the lobby on the ground floor?
Yes.
It was writing on the lobby. If that's what it was, that's what it looked like. I can't recall the detail of that, but it was written in a not table format, but it was written in a columns.
Did you ask the people writing on the wall how they were doing it, and what the ticks and the Fs and the BAs meant?
So at various times I had conversations with Glyn about the information he was getting and how he was getting it, which was from the runners coming across, and then how he was passing that information on, which was to Richard and Pat, and then the Richard and Pat were giving it to the BA crews and the entry control. And then my understanding of ticks was that flats had either been searched or they'd been rescued. But that in itself got confusing because people, I think, were being found in different flats and they weren't sure which flats people were coming out of. Or they were rescuing people, for example, in the staircase and they just didn't know where those people had come from and they weren't able to check with them.
Did you actually ask Glyn Williams what the ticks meant, or was that an assumption?
No, I would have asked what the ticks meant, I think, but I can't recall the conversation. So it's not an assumption that today it's an assumption probably because I can't remember the conversation, what his answer was, but we would have covered it because I think he's crossing them off as well. So I would have and the same as I did on the unit, because I think on the FSG unit they had ticks against some as well.
Yeah. Well, what did the ticks mean? Do you know?
My understanding is that they've been searched or cleared.
Searched or cleared?
Or rescued, so there was no one in them. Yeah.
Right. And then how does that tally up with the lines going through it, with the deletions?
Because you don't need to go to that flat anymore. So it just makes it clearer. When you look down a column, you can just look quite quickly at one that's crossed out to see you don't need to go to it anymore.
Right. Did you notice anybody at the White Wall there receiving information by radio at any stage?
They had their radios on. I can't remember if the radios were clearer by then, but there's every possibility they were using their radios. I can't recall.
Did you take any steps to marry up the information that you saw on the wall with the results of particular deployments to those flats?
I wasn't cross-checking individual flats. I was making sure that that information was given across to Richard and Pat, and therefore the BA crews are being committed. And then there was conversations with Richard and Pat about the flats they were trying to get to and how they were trying to get to them.
Did you know whether individual FSG rescues were let me put the question differently. Did you take steps to satisfy yourself that in general FSG rescues were successful?
It became clear that lots of rescues were being successful, but it wasn't easy linking up where the rescues had come from. So some of them were clear that they'd gone to a certain flat and rescued someone, but it was that they were finding people in different sections. So as I described before, the crews had started finding people in the staircases and lobbies where they weren't expecting them to be, and a lot of the people they were bringing out, they weren't able to ask them which flats they came from, either because of their condition or because they needed to be taken to the ambulance crews quickly. So it was clear that we were carrying out lots of rescues, and there was lots of them carrying out, but it wasn't as clear where the people were coming out from.
Did you become aware when you went to the tower, after having left CU7, how crews were being briefed?
So I watched Pat briefing a number of crews. He was giving them very detailed briefs. He was giving them specific tasks. He was briefing them on the conditions inside the building. He was briefing them clearly on the risks, because we were having to send them up there without necessarily water to protect them. I could see his entry control officers checking them, as in they're safe, their BA sets are on correctly, their face masks and their fire hoods are on correctly, and then he was deploying them into the building. I think there was watch managers with him as well, and they were doing a similar tasks, but I listened to Pat particularly a couple of times, and he was very thoroughly briefing the crews on the tasks they needed to do and the risks that he was aware that they'd be exposed to. And
were you aware of the presence of a station manager, Pete Wolfenden?
I was aware of Pete Wolfenden on the incident ground, yes.
Okay. Were you aware that BA crews were being briefed by Watch Manager Williams and Station Manager Wolfenden, and then rebriefed by Pat Goulbourne and Richard Welch at the Bridgehead?
No, I wasn't aware of that. My understanding was that it was Richard and Pat who were deploying crews, along with the entry control officers and the watch managers supporting Pat.
Right. So did you see for yourself whether Watch Manager Williams or Station Manager Wolfenden were handing pieces of paper to individual BA crews?
I didn't see pieces of paper handed over, no.
Did you examine carefully the line of communication between Williams and Wolfenden at the wall in the lobby and the Bridgehead?
I mean, by that point, you're talking about probably 5 to 6 metres. So you could talk to each other just by talking loudly. So there was no issue with the line of communication. I checked that Richard knew that Glyn was doing the board, if you like, the wall, and that Pat was at that point in the entry control area. So they were clearly communicating. In all the times I went in, there was conversations taking place between them. So communication was that close together that there wasn't an issue with their communication directly.
Did you observe for yourself their communications?
I saw interactions on a number of times between Glyn and Richard and Pat and other officers within that area. So there was lots of communication going on.
Right. How was it happening? Were they shouting, or were they sending each other messages?
You didn't need to shout. I think it was noisy in the lobby. At various times it was very noisy, because obviously when the debris was falling, it became extremely noisy. But generally speaking, you could talk a reasonable voice. You don't generally shout when you're at an incident if you can avoid it. It kind of puts panic in when you'd rather not. So they'd been talking loudly, I have no doubt, but it wasn't shouting.
Did you observe at any stage a heated or passionate or enthusiastic discussion between Pete Wolfenden and Richard Welch, or anybody else at the Bridgehead about
no, not at all.
deployments?
No, I didn't see any heated discussions or anything like that at any point during the incident.
Did you see or observe any discussion between them about the topmost floors beyond which they couldn't access?
No, I didn't. No.
Right. How much time do you think you actually spent in the lobby observing the communications between the White Wall on the left and the Bridgehead once it was down on the ground floor?
So my first entry into the building, I expect I was probably there 5 to 10 minutes. And then I went into the building lots of times after that. I can't recall how often I went in. So it wasn't just on one occasion. I went into the building on a lot of occasions and spoke with Richard, Pat, Glyn and others.
Right. But did you, on your first entry into the building, where was the Bridgehead?
Bridgehead was on the ground floor.
It was on the ground floor?
Yeah, it was behind that glass encasement where the staircase is.
Right. Now, did you take any steps to satisfy yourself or check that the results of particular deployments in response to FSG calls were getting back to the command unit and from there back to control?
So we were getting information back about rescues. We were, that people had been rescued. But I think conversations with Tom was that he wasn't getting enough information back. He told me that. He was getting information about people having been rescued, but he wasn't getting enough information about which flats they were from. And that was because we were getting so many rescues coming out of places we didn't know where they were from, that although he was getting numbers, he wasn't getting the flat numbers. So he understood that there was so much activity going on at the Bridgehead to carry out the rescues that they weren't able to get enough information back to him that he would like. So that discussion did take place. So he was getting information back about rescues being carried out, but it wasn't always specific where those rescues had come from, because there'd been some confusion about where some of the people had been rescued from.
Yeah. Given what you've just said just now, and also what you told us earlier about people coming out from unaffected flats into the stairwell, did you put any system in place to record whether deployments to particular flats had been diverted by crews rescuing people they found?
So that's a system you'd expect from entry control. They'd record where the crews are, and then as they get updates, they'd record where the crews are progressing to. And then if the crews had to retask themselves, you'd expect entry control to then record that. So I was made aware that crews were getting to having to carry out other tasks en route to rescues, but I didn't get involved in individual examples of that.
Right. You say you would expect entry control to record where the crews are as they get updates. Did you check for yourself that they were actually recording where crews were getting to? And
I didn't go and read the information on the entry control boards, no.
You didn't?
No.
Right. Now, on page 23 of your statement, you say that after your conversation with Group Manager Welch, you returned to the CU via the FSG unit and asked Tom Goodall to explain how he was organising the FSG. This is halfway down the page. See that? And then you say, either on this occasion or more likely a little later on, I took 2 photographs, which I identify as my exhibits, AFOL 6 and 7, respectively. We'll come to the photographs in a moment. Your question to Tom Goodall as to how he was organising the FSG information, what did you want to know from him?
So how they were identifying where the FSG calls were coming from, who was involved, where they were, the level of priority for them if we could,
right.
And then others that were involved. So it wouldn't have been just the FSGs, it would have been anyone that they were getting information on inside the building.
What had you seen, if anything, from your trip to the tower that prompted you to ask Tom Goodall that question when you got back to the FSG CU?
To check that what he was trying to put in place was being effective for him, and whether he needed any support from me to help him make it effective. But what he seemed to be put in place seemed to be working effectively, as a recording of the information that he was getting into that unit, so effectively the table that they were setting up.
Right. Did you have any discussion with him about the results of particular deployments?
So possibly not on this occasion, but we were, throughout the night, as I went to Tom, I was talking about the rescues that were being carried out, and that's where he was getting information about the numbers of people being rescued, and sometimes getting flat numbers, but he wasn't getting enough of it, so because we didn't know a lot of the flats where the people had come out from. So he had numbers of people rescued quite often, but he wasn't able to link those to the flats they'd been rescued from.
Now, we talked about prioritisation earlier, and you said that on your first visit to the CU, Tom Goodall had simply been prioritising FSG calls as such. When you went to the tower the first time, before coming back to the CU and talking to Tom Goodall on this occasion, had you formed any view about how the Bridgehead, in effecting deployments, was actually prioritising FSG calls?
So the Bridgehead is going to just prioritise those they think they can get to at that point in time. So I didn't get into the detail of how they were going to do that. It was that they would deploy people, based on the information they're getting, they'd deploy them to the ones they thought they could get to at that point.
Did you not need to know what method they were using to prioritise one FSG over another, so that you could take that information back to Tom Goodall?
At that point in time, again, they were getting so much information at that point in time, trying to break down individual FSG calls was incredibly difficult for them. So my expectation was they were doing it on what they believed they could achieve. I wasn't interrogating them on how that was working. I was trusting that what they were putting in place was to prioritise those FSG calls, which they were,
yeah,
and those that they thought they could get to, and they had to treat them one at a time. I don't think at that point they were themselves trying to break them down into individual priorities, as in one over another. They were trying to work out what they thought they could achieve.
So what did you observe as to the system of prioritisation by Welch and Goulburn at the Bridgehead?
So prioritisation is FSG calls, but they've got obviously a huge number of them to deal with, and they'll deal with them one at a time.
When you say one at a time, was it first come, first serve, or did they prioritise?
I don't recall if it was first come, first serve. I think it would probably be based on where they thought they could get the crews to at that point in time.
Well, you say that they probably, but did you not explore with care yourself as to precisely how they were going about deciding which FSG to respond to before another FSG?
No, my understanding was that they would know that the floors they thought they could get crews to, and that they would send the crews to those floors. But there wasn't breaking down at that point into individual priorities. It was just what they thought they could get crews to.
Did you have a conversation with either Richard Welch or Pat Goulburn about how they decided between one FSG call and another FSG call?
No, we just treated all the FSG calls equally, and they tried to get to as many as they could.
Right.
And I think they would have done that one at a time, based on what they thought they could get to at that point in time, and where they could get the crews to.
Does that mean that where FSG information came to the Bridgehead saying children or people with mobility issues, they weren't given any kind of priority?
I can't recall if we were I don't think we were breaking it down on that as a priority. I think it was that all of them were being treated as a priority. All the FSG calls were a priority, and they were trying to get to all of them throughout the time they were there.
Did you report that back to Tom Goodall?
That they were trying to get to all the FSG calls, yes, he would have known they're trying to get to everyone.
No. Did you report back to Tom Goodall that at the Bridgehead there was no system of prioritising one FSG over another based on any particular characteristics of the caller or the conditions in the flat?
I don't think I had that conversation with Tom, no.
Okay. Now, on page 24 of your statement, you say, at the top of the page, I got back to Andy on the command unit, that's CU8, and briefed him on the changes to the fire. And then in the third line you say, I stated that inside was working effectively, but they had a lot of work to do. I also stated that I was happy with what the FSG were doing, but the numbers were high. Did you tell him that you were happy in the way you described there? Is happy a word you used?
I don't know if I'd have said happy. I think I would have said I would have explained what was in place. So I would have explained that we had control, passing the information onto the FSG unit. The FSG unit was identifying where the FSG calls were coming from, which floors, because by that time they had the floor numbers, so which floors they were on, and that they were getting that information across to the fire sector, and they were recording it within the lobby, and that they were deploying crews to carry out rescues. But I would have also explained at that point in time the volume of what they were trying to deal with.
Right. Did you tell
actually,
sorry, I'm so sorry.
What they were trying to deal with was enormous.
Right. Did you tell Andy Rowe that there was no system, from what you could see, there was no system of prioritising one FSG over another, and that they were all being treated as a single priority, as a group?
I think by that point, I think later on they started putting priorities onto some of them where they put Ps onto the table, but it was, again, it was subjective where they thought people were most at risk, and it wasn't necessarily where the fire sector thought they could get crews to. So it would have come back to, I don't recall a conversation with Andy about the prioritisation, but it comes back to, I don't think we'd ever expected to have to start prioritising one fire survival guidance call over another, and then putting that in place, and then how you decide that one person, because of a reason, is prioritised over another. I don't think that's something I'd considered we'd have to do before.
Can I then take you then to the photographs you took? MET 00015703. Do you know, or can you remember roughly what time you took this photograph?
I think it was time-stamped, so I can't off the top of my head. I think it was after 4 o'clock, I think it was.
Right. Could you see from that Tom Goodall, at least, and his crew in the command unit were using a system of prioritisation?
Yeah, so I think this was a little bit later on, and I think you were getting to the point now where the priorities were becoming people who, in their view, were now, if they weren't rescued imminently, they were most at risk of not being rescued at all.
Right.
And I think he also, I don't know if his photograph covers it, but there's people who the phone lines had now gone dead. So effectively what they were thinking is that the priorities, I think, by this point is if we don't get to these people might not survive.
Right. But at any rate, at some point during your role as FSG sector commander, you knew that Tom Goodall was affecting prioritisation as between FSG calls, hence the P in a circle.
Yes, and I think that's based on the risk that those people they feel they're exposed to. So all of those people in all of those calls are exposed to the smoke and heat and flames. They're at risk, so all of them are a priority. And then as it gets worse, as the conditions were getting worse and worse for them, I think that's how they were becoming more of a priority. So it was based on the conditions that those people were suffering that the priority was put on, rather than trying to put an individual person against another individual person. It was based on the thoughts on the command unit team about who actually was now most at risk based on the calls coming in.
Did you understand that there to be any prioritisation as between adults and children on that board?
I don't recall that. I mean, children are clearly much more vulnerable to the products of smoke, but again, I think it was purely based on who we thought was most at risk at that point in time, and every one of those people was at risk. So to then prioritise one against another would be incredibly challenging and difficult to do. So I think it was who they thought was most at risk, bearing in mind that everyone there was at a huge amount of risk.
Well, let me just show you a different picture. MET 15924, which is a full picture of the grid on CU7 with the table below it. If we could just blow that up. You can see the table there, and it's been explained to us by Tom Goodall and other firefighters who've come to the inquiry before, Mr. O'Loughlin. But you can see green are adults, black are kids, and then with a ring, P priority, and then P priority in a square line gone dead. And then you can see the asterisk BA have gone there. Did you ever gain an understanding of the prioritisation system indicated by this grid at any stage during the night?
So if I recall, I think every one of the calls was treated as a priority. They weren't put one against the other until the occupants were, if you like, in imminent danger of most likely dying. And I think the step would go from the priority to the priority with the square around it, which is where we've now lost contact with them.
You say they were all treated as a priority. I just wonder whether that's really correct. Because, for example, one could pick an example at random. 164 in the middle column has got a 1 next to it, which is an adult because it's green, but no P, no indication of any other kind of prioritisation. So just on that example, is it really right to say that all these callers were FSG callers?
Every FSG call is treated by a priority, so everybody on that fireground would have known that the FSG calls are a priority because that's how we treat them. What Tom's tried to achieve there is then trying to prioritise those calls, which is an incredibly difficult task to do and quite subjective based on what information you're getting through from that call. So 164 is still a priority, as are all the other calls. What they're identifying is where they think people are now at imminent danger or imminent risk of potentially dying. They're made more of a priority, but it's an incredibly difficult job for them to have done that. Every one of those fire survival guidance calls was treated as a priority, and every one of them is a priority. Right.
So but you say some were treated as more of a priority. Well, let's take them. Did you ever get to understand how Tom Goodall was treating callers as more of a priority than the other priority FSG callers?
So it was the risk they were exposed to. So in simple terms, I suppose, if the smoke is getting worse and worse in their flat and directly affecting them more and more, or if the flames are getting closer and closer to them, if on the phone call the control officer can tell that actually this person now is starting to lose breath, is starting to say that person is now at imminent danger rather than just at danger, which they all were, obviously, because every single fire survival guidance call was someone in danger.
Yes, I see. So, and you understood that system at some point during the night?
That's the system I recall. At that point, they were trying to work out how to prioritise fire survival guidance calls, and it's almost an impossible task to do, to put a fire survival guidance call above another and to make it more important than another, other than in the risk that they are exposed to, which is to say that if somebody is, the phone calls that control officers were probably taken were people starting to lose their breath and starting to not being able to breathe.
Right.
And they may have put that as a priority over someone else who is in a flat and unable to escape. But it becomes quite subjective.
But did you actually ask Tom Goodall, this is a very interesting board, tell me exactly how you are putting, or why you are putting P around some and not others? Did you actually ask him that question?
I asked him why they were priority. I think he said that it was because they're the most at risk. So I took that to mean that they are in imminent danger. So they're all in danger, but these ones are in imminent danger of dying if they're not rescued soon. That's how I took that to mean.
At any stage in the night, did you then check with the Bridgehead whether those calls that were being given a P by Tom Goodall were being prioritised by deployment of
I
P?
checked if that information was going across to the Bridgehead, which it was. It was going into the search coordinator, so it was going into the lobby. The issue with them became that the entry control could only deploy to the floors they thought they could get to. So there was a conflict almost to a certain extent with regard to, although these are priorities, they might not be able to get to those floors. So they were still focusing on the floors they thought they could get to. And this ranged on the night of, you could almost get to higher floors sometimes because they were unaffected by heat and smoke, and sometimes you couldn't get to a lower floor because it was so well alight. So Pat and Richard both had a good understanding of where they felt they could send crews in that building based on what the conditions were, and they were trying to get crews to those particular flats.
Right. Mr. Chairman, it may be appropriate to have another break at this point. I'm not quite finished, but I'm not far off the end,
Yes.
I'm afraid.
Well, it probably would be a good point, wouldn't it? I think we'll have another break, Mr. O'Loughlin. Same as before, please don't speak to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. We'll resume at 22:12.
Okay, thank you.
Good, 20 to 12, please. right, all ready to go, Mr.
Yes, sir.
O'Loughlin? Good, thank you.
Mr. O'Loughlin, thank you for coming back. Can I show you another picture of the grid on CU7 that was taken a little bit earlier in the night? It's MET quadruple 08663. Now, this is a picture taken by watch manager Gerling. I don't know whether the name rings a bell with you. On CU7 of this grid, and the time period for that, we don't have an exact time, is between 3:15 a.m. and about 4 a.m. So this is a photograph of this grid at an earlier stage. Do you remember seeing this when you came back to to CU7, having visited the tower?
I can't recall if that was the time I saw the grid for the first time. I know they had changed relatively quickly from the list to the grid. There's a good chance this is about the right time that I could be going back there, but I couldn't tell you if that's the time I saw the grid or the next time I went on to the FSG unit.
Right.
But it's about the right time, but I can't recall if the second time I went on to the FSG unit, the list was still there and they were starting the table, or if the table had been put in place. So I can't recall if that was the time or not.
Did you notice at that stage that the grid contained a prioritization system, P with a ring round it?
I don't know if I noticed at that stage, because at that stage I can't be certain that was when I saw that grid. But whenever I first saw the Ps, a conversation I would have had with Tom is, what's the priority there? And I think it was that they are at the greatest risk, and that was based on the telephone conversations they were having, and it was on the fact that, I say, my understanding of it was that the control officers and the command unit crews thought that those people were most likely to die if we weren't able to get to them soon.
Right. Now, going on to your role as fire sector commander.
Sorry, sir, I was not the fire sector commander.
Well, no, not fire sector commander. Operations commander,
Yes.
overseeing for the fire sector itself.
Yes.
So that's more an accurate way of describing your role.
Yes.
Right. What responsibilities in that role did you have for tactical decision making?
So I've designated the fire sector. They've got the authority to carry out the tasks they need to carry out what they need to achieve. My role is to make sure they're resourced for it, make sure that what they're trying to do is the objectives that I've set them or that the incident commander has set them, and that to check on the tasks that they're carrying out are meeting that. So I wouldn't change the tactics they're doing within that, apart from if I thought they needed to be changed, which I didn't. They'd ask if the tactics they were using were sufficient. So as an example, they were sending crews above fires without firefighting media, which is a risk, and they did check in if they were able to do that, and that's the sort of thing I would expect them to ask me, and I agreed with that approach, and I think I informed Andy that was the approach we were taking, and he understood that.
I see.
So they've got the delegated authority within the fire sector, and my role was to make sure they're trying to achieve the objectives and agree in the tactics they were trying to use, and if they needed any further assistance, whether it's resources or a different approach, I can support them in that.
Right. And does that mean that you yourself, apart from the one example you gave about going above the fire without water, apart from that, does that mean that you didn't actually make any tactical decisions yourself? It was delegated to them?
It's delegated to them, and then they would form me the decisions. They tell me the tactics they're using to achieve the objectives they're trying to get to, and then I would agree those tactics, or if I didn't think those tactics were appropriate, I could change those tactics. I didn't have reason to change the tactics they were using. They were committing as many crews as they could to those they thought they could get to as rapidly as they could.
Now, taking it in stages, once you had taken over your role as operations commander overseeing this fire sector, what were the tactics being adopted by the fire sector, Pat Goulbourne and Richard Welsh?
I suppose in simple terms, they were sending as many BA crews as they could into the tower to rescue people, both SDBA and EDBA, and they were deploying them to the flats they thought they could get crews to. At the same time, they were carrying out firefighting actions. I can't remember which floors at different times, but sometimes the conditions on some of the floors were so severe that they had to protect the staircase from those conditions, so they were deploying firefighting crews as well.
Right.
So there were the two primary ways they were trying to achieve their goal, was to send BA crews in to rescue people and to use firefighters to protect the escape route.
Okay, those are the goals or objectives. I understand that. My question perhaps was slightly more refined. What were the tactics or strategies that they were going to adopt, the methods, if you like, by which to achieve those objectives?
So they would identify a BA crew, they would get that BA crew briefed on what they were to achieve, so they were given details of where they were expected to go, who they were expected to rescue, the conditions they might encounter, how they could achieve it, the challenges they were going to be faced with, because we knew that it was very challenging at that point in time. They would then get that crew to book in with BA control and make sure that they understand the role they've got, to make sure that they are safe from what they're going to be carrying out. And then those crews would be deployed into the building to carry out the task that they were given, and then they would report back on their progress.
Right. Coming back to this question of prioritisation, am I to take it from what you told us before that throughout the time you were in command of the fire sector, in your role as operations commander, they were responding to FSG calls or demands for rescue on a first come first served basis?
Once it was a first come first served, no, they were doing it on where they realistically thought they could get crews to at that point.
Right.
So in some cases they were pushing crews to very high floors, probably above the 17th, 18th, 19th. If they'd get them there at the same time, they were sending crews to lower floors, and often it was based on the conditions the crews were encountering. So they were sending it. So it wasn't first come first serve. It was more where they thought they could get the crews to, and they were deploying lots of them to achieve that.
Did you become aware at any point that Richard Welch and Pat Goulburn had changed the system of deployment from what had been operating earlier on?
Changed in... I don't think the system had changed. It was still that they would deploy firefighters to rescue people, and where we had to reduce firefighting to protect the escape.
Were you aware that they had changed a system and were now, after a particular point, deploying firefighters up the building, starting with the lowest floors, and clearing those and working up from there?
I don't recall that tactic being used, no.
Right. Were you aware at any stage that they were sometimes sending EDBA wearers to the lowest floors?
No, my expectation, I think my recollection of it is EDBA crews were being sent to the higher floors because that's where they'd be most used.
Right. Did you know that it wasn't until did you know, let's start with 3 o'clock, or just after 3 o'clock in the morning, that the 3rd EBA crew, which tallied out from the Bridgehead at 3:03, which was a two-man EDBA crew of Cod and Joseph, were deployed, but didn't reach further than floor 10? Did you know that, for example?
I didn't know the detail of that crew, no.
Did you know that a 4-person crew tallied out at 3:04 to protect egress on the 4th floor?
I didn't know that, but if that was a task that needed to be done at that time, I expect they would be deployed to do that task.
Right, that was an EDBA crew. Did you know that EDBA crews were being tasked at that time to protect egress on the 4th floor?
I didn't check in what individual crews were doing. My expectation was the EDBA would be used for the higher floors, but there may well have been a reason why that EDBA crew was used, but I don't know what that reason would be.
Right. Was it a reasonable firefighting strategy to use EDBA crews to protect the egress on the 4th floor?
If the conditions were particularly difficult on the 4th floor and affecting the staircase, for example, at that point in time, so if the conditions on the 4th floor were untenable and then made the whole staircase untenable, you'd want to deploy a crew to quickly deal with that fire. If that meant that the crew available to you was EDBA, you would want to deploy them. You'd want to deploy a crew to deal with the fire so that the staircase doesn't become untenable. So if my understanding is what you said is the conditions, they went to firefight because of the egress, that would mean that the conditions on the 4th floor must have been significant enough that they needed to be dealt with to try to protect the staircase for access and egress.
Yeah. My question is really, were you aware that decision, or that kind of decision, had been made by Pat Goulburn and Richard Welch?
I wasn't aware of where individual crews were being, each individual crew was being deployed to, so I wouldn't have been aware that an EDBA crew had been deployed to the 4th floor, but I was aware that crews were being deployed to us to protect the access and egress.
Okay, because you say your expectation was that EDBA crews would be sent to the higher floor. That I understand. My question really is, did you ever learn anything from which you understood that actually that expectation wasn't correct and that EDBA crews weren't always being sent to the higher floors?
Certainly my understanding was the majority of the EDBA crews were sent to the higher floors. If others were deployed to other tasks, there may well have been good reason to do that. But my understanding, certainly in the time I was the operations commander and when I went in the building, was that the EDBA crews were going to the higher floors.
Did you find out how Pat Goulbourne and Richard Welch were dealing with a situation where an EDBA crew encountered a rescue in the stairs or in a lobby and was deviated from the deployment they'd been sent to.
How they were dealing with it. So if an EDBA crew came across someone to be rescued, my expectation is they would have to rescue that person.
Yes.
They wouldn't be able to walk past them, for example. So you have to trust the judgment of the firefighters that if they feel that person has to be rescued, then it means they'll have to stop the task they were trying to achieve and rescue that person.
Right.
And then pass that information back to entry control, and by the very nature of it, to Bridgehead. And then most likely the Bridgehead would have to redeploy another crew, or if they were able to redeploy that crew again.
Yeah, you say most likely. My question is a bit more specific. Did you actually find out for yourself how Richard Welch and Pat Goulbourne were going about getting that information from the crew which had been diverted and then redeploying a fresh EDBA crew to carry out the rescue for which that original crew had been deployed?
So it was clear that during the night crews were carrying out tasks which hadn't been assigned because they were coming across rescues to carry out. That was happening on a number of occasions.
Yes.
And that information, where it was getting back to the Bridgehead, either by radio or by the crew themselves coming back, then meant that crews had to be deployed again, or that same crew redeployed to carry out the original task. So when they were getting information back that the crew wasn't able to achieve their original task, they were redeploying crews either to that same task or sending another crew in.
Right. Did you discover that crews had gone to flats, not been able to, or not carried out the rescue from those flats, and then told the occupants to stay where they were, and that crews were going to come for them?
I wasn't aware of that on the night, no.
Right. Would that be something that you would have wanted to know in your role as operations commander?
Yes, but there was so much information going on within that Bridgehead and within that rescue plan with all those firefighters. They wouldn't have been able to tell me about every single individual deployment. So yeah, there's so much information going on at that point that I couldn't expect to have every single update on every single crew and every single action. So it would have been useful for me to know it, but there was so much going on that night, you couldn't expect them to give me a brief on every single crew's action.
Did you consider whether you had enough EDBA crews on hand to be able to effect the rescues that needed
so
carrying out?
I'd originally ordered 10 FRUs, which would be around 40 to 45 EDBA wearers. My understanding, speaking to Andy, probably when I took over afterwards as the operations commander, he'd ordered, I think the words were, I've ordered all the EDBA in the brigade. And then with Andy's agreement, I think it was Andy's decision possibly, but between us we agreed that the EDBA wearers, who would normally only wear their sets once, would wear their sets twice.
Yeah.
So if you like, that's all the EDBA that we had available to us, and we had it all there. At no point did Richard or Pat say they had run out of EDBA, or nor were we close to running out of EDBA. So we couldn't ask for any more. There was no more available to us. And it never came up as an issue that we ran out of EDBA, but we did need to ask them to wear their sets twice, which is we don't normally do with EDBA.
Right. Well, I just wonder if you could explain something to us. If you go to the row log, which is MET*0005404, I just wanted to ask you to look at time mark 0339. So this is only about 40 minutes or so after I think you take over operational command, with responsibility for the fire sector, and it says there, Pat Goulbourne, PG, in fire sector, carried out a tactical withdrawal of all BA and moved Bridgehead to ground floor, EDBA being committed to fourth floor for search and rescue and firefighting, make-up for EDBA requested from PG. Do you know anything about that request for a make-up of EDBA by Pat Goulbourne?
No, I don't. No. It wasn't communicated to me, but...
Do you know what... Can you give us a clue as to why that sort of thing wouldn't be communicated to you?
So it's quite possible that if it's saying it's from Matt Cook was, like I was, going in and out of the building quite a lot. I might not have been available at that point. I could have been doing another task and I said the radios were not working. I wouldn't have expected Pat to delay that request I would have expected Pat to want to get that to the incident commander as quickly as possible. The incident commander has to order on the additional resources. I can only request them. So Pat would have known that I would never have said no to that. So I think it's quicker to get the update to the incident commander as a request rather than wait to go through me, if you like, if I wasn't immediately available. What I was made aware of was that we were requesting all the EDBA that we had. So I'm guessing the result of that request was that all the EDBA that we had in the brigade was ordered to the incident.
Does that mean that you were out of the communications loop? Just in relation to that issue?
Radios at this point were still overwhelmed, so the communications loop for me was direct contact with people.
Right.
So I wouldn't say it's a matter of being out of the communications. I think it's an understanding that if Pat needs those resources, he can go straight to the incident commander to request them. I think if it's come from Matt, it probably means he's had to send Matt back to the command unit to request it. I don't know what I'd have been doing at that particular time, but it's a reasonable request to do. It's even possible at that time that I'm on the command unit because I had to give Andy an update on where we were. So.
Right.
But as a request, that sort of request, an officer would accept it. It's urgent and it can be done directly to the incident commander.
Okay. But I think your evidence is, I don't want to summarise it unfairly, you didn't know about this request for a make-up of EDBA wearers from Pat Goulbourne.
No, so I didn't know Pat had requested it, but I knew that we had, or Andy had requested all of the EDBA resources that we had.
Does it follow that you can't help us as to why he requested it at that time?
I think by this time it was clear that it was clear that the building fire was significantly worse than it had been when I'd first arrived. So by this point, the south side of the building is alight, or the south face of the building, I should say, is alight. The internal building, it was clear now that we had fire on multiple floors, not just on individual flats. So it would have become clear that we needed as much EDBA as possible. Right.
Now, can I ask you to go back to page 21 of your statement, where you deal, I think, with the first time you brief Richard Welch and Pat Goulbourne in the fire sector, and tell me if that's not right. A third of the way down the page you say, I updated him with the number of pumps we had at the incident and that Andy Rowe had ordered all of the FRU and EDBA resources in the LFB so that BA supplies should not be an issue for him. In fact, we couldn't have physically got any more crews into the building as it just wasn't big enough and had to adopt a staged approach. What is a staged approach? Or what is the stage? What is the stage approach there that you're referring to?
So we physically had probably at that point somewhere between 300 to 350 firefighters on the incident ground.
Yeah.
The majority of which can wear breathing apparatus. You couldn't physically fit 350 firefighters in breathing apparatus into that staircase. So you would deploy them via the entry control in as high a numbers as you can, as quickly as you can. And in fact, what they were doing was almost queuing up to go in and carry out the tasks that required them. So you're effectively putting the crews in when you have been able to brief them and give them a task to carry out.
Right. How would you decide what stages or divisions between stages were?
I wouldn't say so. Maybe staged is a confusing term. Then I think the point is that you've got as many firefighters as we needed at the incident,
yes.
And you would deploy as many as you can into the building. My point would be you can't deploy. So as the EDBA being an example, you wouldn't have been able to deploy. So if there's 14, roughly around 100 firefighters into that building in one go. So you'd deploy groups of them at a time, and then when they finished, you redeploy other groups, and that's normal operations at a fire. In that you'd commit breathing apparatus crews, whether it's EDBA or SDBA, and then you replace them with new crews, and then you carry that on over the hours that you're at the incident
right.
for. You physically can't fit, 100, 200 firefighters into a building.
At that stage, when you were briefing Welch and Goulbourne as fire sector commanders, did you suggest to them that they should send as many EDBA wearers as they had on hand as high up in the building as they could and work down?
No, at that point in time, they were still focusing on the fire survival guidance calls as a priority, and they were on different floors, so they weren't all on the highest floors. Right. And so it was still deploying crews, SDBA and EDBA, to all the floors.
Is there any reason why you didn't or couldn't have suggested to them at least that, or ordered them to send as many EDBA wearers up as high as they could and work down?
It's not the tactic we were employing. We were employing the tactic that you knew where the people were who were the fire survival guidance calls. They were your priority to get to them. So it was deploying them to those particular to those particular flats. And you could use both SDVA and EDBA for that, because SDVA can still gives you 30 minutes of air, so they can still be deployed into the building.
Now you say in the next sentence, I had wanted to speak with Pat, but in the 5 to 8 minutes that I was there, he was continually briefing crews, so it just wasn't possible. Can you just tell us, what did you want to talk to Pat about?
So that's when I first entered the building. So I'd had a conversation with Richard, which I think we probably covered, and then I wanted to speak to Pat about how he was doing, but he was so busy briefing crews that I'd have had to interrupt him and to get a briefing from him. And I'd had a good briefing from Richard, so it would have been nice to have had the conversation with Pat and see if he needed anything from me at that point in time. But actually, Richard was the fire sector commander, so I'd had an update that was sufficient for what I needed. So it would have been a nice to do, but it wasn't essential, and it certainly wasn't more important than the briefings he was giving at that point in time to the crews that were going in.
Page 27 of your statement, a third of the way down, paragraph starts, I would estimate I went in to speak with Richard and Pat at least 8 to 10 times, if not more. They gave the same information again and again that they were still carrying out rescues. Did they ever give you any information about an inability to reach certain floors?
So throughout the night there were some floors that we couldn't get to because the conditions were so severe, and that was on different floors, so it wasn't always that it was on the higher floors. No. I think I remember talking to a watch manager at one point who'd come down and said something like the 9th and 11th floors were going, so you couldn't get in them, don't try and send crews to those. And then I remember he said something like the 13th floor is clear, and that felt like how it was all night, that it was where you would just expect the higher floors perhaps to be the ones alight. It was random floors that were more severely involved. They were certainly trying to get crews to the highest floors they possibly could. I recall Pat, until virtually the end, a target was the 19th floor, where he was aiming to get crews to. The highest I think I heard crews had got to was the 21st or 22nd floor, and I think that was at the early stages. But I think even later on we were still getting up to, I don't think we'd get to the 19th floor towards the end, but they were getting up to the 16th or 17th floor, I think, as the night went on. Right. But there was challenges, but some floors they couldn't get into because the conditions were just so severe.
Did you learn of a decision at any stage to deploy EDBA wearers only above the 10th floor and SDBA wearers only below the 10th floor? I
can't recall that on the night as a decision, but it would be a sensible decision. So if it was taken, I would have gone along with it and agreed with it. I can't recall it. And looking on the board where it was written up, I almost certainly would have known that. I can't recall it on the night, but it's a sensible decision to make.
Right. Do you recall anybody from the tower telling CU7 that the decision had been made not to deploy above the 15th floor?
No, I don't recall that.
You don't?
No.
Do you recall a decision, the communication of a decision coming from the tower to CU7 not to deploy above the 11th floor?
There was points in the incident where they weren't able to send crews above certain floors, and the 10th and 11th, when they were severely involved, became an issue. So they had to deal with firefighting on that floor to allow crews to get past it. And that happened at least on one occasion, possibly more, where they had to deal with the fire, which was breaking into the staircase. So they had to deal with the fire to stop them, to allow the crews to get past that particular point. And that happened on a couple of occasions, I think.
I'm so sorry. Did you yourself learn, do you remember learning that there was a particular floor above which crews could not go?
About the middle of the building rings a bell, so the 10th and 11th floor, around that area.
Right. Did you take any steps yourself to tell control, or to tell CU7 to tell control, that there was an upper floor limit beyond which crews couldn't go?
It wasn't a limit that we were still going to go past it, we just needed to fight the fire at that time. So it wasn't that we'd stopped trying to get above that floor, it wasn't that we weren't going to try to get above that floor, it's just that for a period of time they were going to have to fight the fire, and that would then allow the crews to go past it. I didn't communicate that to control personally, but at that point, but it wasn't that they were going to stop trying to get above the 10th and 11th floors, it was that for that moment in time they needed to fight the fire to then allow crews to go past it.
Right. Was it not important, though, as operations commander, in command of both sectors, fire and FSG, to make sure that what you knew about maximum floor deployments in the fire sector was communicated back through CU7 FSG sector to control?
It was... Can you say the question again?
Yeah. Was it not important, given your role as operations commander, commanding both sectors, was it not important for you to ensure that the fact that crews couldn't get above a certain floor was communicated back to control?
I don't think we'd have had the time to do that. I think we were so busy focusing on getting the crews in for the rescues. I think getting that information back to control, I'm not sure we'd have been able to do that at that point in time. And it was different floors that affected. So that particular one was the 10th and 11th floor. But there was times when there were severe fires on different floors that we weren't able to get into. So you'd have had to effectively try and give control a briefing on every single time you've got a fire on a floor that you're needing to deal with. In that level of detail, we wouldn't normally pass that amount of detail back to control.
Did you give any consideration to the use of second set bags or spare BA sets for safe evacuation of residents through these stairs?
It's not the purpose of those sets. It's a difficult thing to use, so they probably weigh in the region of about 18 kilograms, so it's the equivalent of pretty much your holiday suitcase. Were you trying to take one of those up a stairs, or a crew trying to carry that up 10, 20 flights of stairs is difficult. It would affect your breathing rate. Then being able to use it on a casualty, they're not easy to use. People are not used to having face masks on their face. It's not a nice thing to do. And then you'd have to either assist or carry the casualty down with the set as well, which you've still 18 kilograms. So it's not something that we'd used it for before. I think I might have been made aware on the night that it was used. I understand it was used, but it's not what we would normally use as a tactic to get people out of the building.
Yeah. You say, I think you might have been made aware on the night that it was used. More specifically, were you informed that a crew had successfully used spare BA sets to evacuate occupants?
I'm aware that happened, and I can't be definite if I know that from the night or if I know that subsequently.
Right. Okay. Andy Walton says in his evidence that he was aware of the particular instance. It's the occupants of flat 65 on floor 9, and he didn't hesitate to authorise it. Do you recall yourself knowing that on the night?
I wasn't aware Andy Walton had done that, no.
Is using spare masks in this way something that firefighters are trained to do?
No, the only reason we use a spare mask is if a firefighter gets into difficulty. So, for example, if a firefighter runs out of air, that's the point of the set, is you take the set in to rescue the firefighter. The firefighter is used to having a face mask on their face, which is most people wouldn't like because it's quite claustrophobic. They're quite used to breathing in a face mask, which is, again, an unusual experience. So the only purpose of it was for firefighters and firefighter rescue.
Did you actually on the night go through the thought processes yourself of asking yourself, well, why shouldn't we use, on this occasion, second set bags or spare BA sets to evacuate residents?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Now, were you aware or were you told of a period of no deployments in response to FSG calls?
No, not no deployments. I was not aware of any time when we were not committing crews into the building to rescue people.
Right. Can I just ask you to look then at the row log at page 3? And I just want to look at 2 time marks with you in that. For 422, first of all, which is on page 3, 0422. And this is the row log recording. Mick Mulholland, MM, gives update. Crews up to the 10th floor in EDBA. SDBA, that should say, 4th and 5th floors, 7th, 8th and 9th floor considering using aerial. EDBA is being used quickly. And then Andy O'Loughlin, no active FSGs at this time, and last were on 7th, 8th and 9th floors. Crews in and out is compromised by debris drop down and several casualties jumping. First of all, do you recall this discussion?
I recall a discussion I had with Tom, and it had gone effectively quiet on the FSG unit.
Right.
I can't recall the time. I'm sure it could have been around that time, and then I would have updated Andy on that.
Yeah. Was this, what's recorded here is you saying something, and it's recorded in this log. Was this at a meeting on CU8? Do you remember?
Not so much a meeting, no. So I expect it's an update that I'm giving Andy, possibly on CU8, but I was talking to Andy on the instant ground a couple of times as well.
Right.
And obviously Jackie was recording what our discussions were.
Okay. Were you talking to him over your airwave radio or over the...
Every conversation with Andy was face-to-face that night.
It was face-to-face?
Yes.
Okay, so not by radio?
No, every conversation with Andy was face-to-face.
I see, okay. And when you say, and I know these are not your words in writing, but when it is said, you said no active FSGs at this time, what does that mean?
So that means on the FSG unit, the conversations that were taking place with control, all of those lines have effectively gone dead now. It
Right.
doesn't mean that there's not crews being deployed still. We continued deploying crews all night and into the next day. So there was no giving up on those. It was just that the calls themselves now they're no longer on the line.
Okay. I just wonder if we can just look at a little detail on that. Can I ask you please to look at the control report at page 170? And I'll do it on the screen. You can see that at the foot of page 170, we've got calls at 3:57, or a call at 3:57:28 from flat 83, floor 11, one adult, caller is daughter-in-law. And then over the top of the next page, at top of the next page, page 171, we've got 040102, a call from flat 204, one adult, daughter calling on behalf of her father. And then 4:33, which is after the time of this discussion you had with Andy Rowe, flat 82 at floor 11. We can see a half an hour gap or so. Does that help you explain what you mean when you say there were no active FSGs? Is it that gap you're referring to?
No, I can't recall the time.
Right.
I recall a conversation with Tom on the FSG unit that effectively all of the FSG calls had finished. There was no more FSG calls coming in. It wasn't to say they didn't have other information either from members of public on the ground or other information coming in, but the active FSG calls to the point where the line is still talking to someone, my understanding was that has finished at a point. I don't recall the time of that, but if Jackie's recorded it as 0422, then it's possible that was the time. I can't link that into what those callers are and whether they are fire survival guidance calls or not.
Right. Did you know, or do you know, what Andy Rowe did with that information? The information that there were no further FSGs, no active FSGs?
I don't know what he did with that information, no.
Secondly, can I ask you to look at the time mark of 5:20 in Andy Rowe's notes, which is on page 4. Where in the second line, page 4 of the Rowe log, 5:20, it says, Andy O'Loughlin, bariatric fatal on 18th. Persons are still coming out. Persons seen on balcony. First of all, do you remember giving Andy Rowe that information?
I think I was told about 2 casualties on the staircase, and there was one of them which bariatric probably was what I was told.
I'm sorry, it's my fault. My question was too vague. Focusing on persons are still coming out, do you remember giving Andy Rowe that information?
I think that probably means we're still carrying out rescues, I expect. I mean,
right.
Yes, like I said, the times of that I can't recall, but if that's the recording, I don't doubt we'd have rescued somebody at that point, I expect, is what I'm saying.
Right. And do you know whether they were live rescues?
I wouldn't know if they were live rescues.
Okay. So when you said persons still coming out, what did you intend to convey to Andy?
So I don't think that's a term I would have used, so it's probably paraphrased. I think I would have said we are carrying out rescues or there are rescues still.
Right.
I don't think I'd have said persons are coming out, but effectively it means we are still going. There's still the possibility there are people in this building that are alive and we are still deploying crews to try and rescue them.
Yeah. And then you say persons seen on balcony. Did you not know by quite early on in the incident, in fact I think on arrival, as you told us yesterday, that actually Grenfell Tower didn't have any balconies?
I knew there were no balconies. That's possibly, I believe, somebody had fallen from the building, fell onto the balcony on the walkway to the side. So I don't know if that's the one I was talking about. I never saw that person. But my understanding is one of the persons who fell from the building fell onto the balcony area of the neighbouring building to the south side of the...
Right.
There definitely were no balconies in the flat, so it wasn't someone on a balcony in a flat.
Right. And the note goes on to say, AR, that's I'm assuming Andy Rowe, is wet riser up and running. Was that a question that he asked you?
If it was, there was no wet riser, so I don't recall the question, but there was no wet riser.
No. Do you
There
remember?
was talk at one point, sorry, my apologies, there was talk at one point about possibly using the aerial as an alternative rising main. So whether that is what he was referring to,
Right.
I'm not sure, but there was no wet riser, so if that was a question, I would have said there was no wet riser.
To your way of thinking, were you confident that Andy Rowe knew there was no wet riser in this
I
building?
think Andy would have known there was no wet riser. Well, he would have known from my briefing that there was no wet riser, it was a dry riser.
Right. Can I just ask you one or two final questions? First of all, your email, which you exhibit 4 to your statement, which is MET 00015,708. That email to self refers at 2:17 to DSE gas electric. DSE we've discussed. Gas. What does that refer to?
So that's a request for the gas board and the electricity board. So again, in a large structural fire where you know there's gas or electric that may become involved, or by that point it could be confirmed involved,
Right.
you request the gas and electricity board in case you need to shut off the supplies to the building. That's a standard request.
Right. Did you request that?
I requested that at the same time as the DSE was requested.
Did
And
you
it's a standard request that you do at any structural fire where you've got firefighters fighting.
Okay. And you say it's standard. Did you have any specific information which meant that the gas needed to be shut off?
Not the gas in particular, no. But my expectation was there'd be gas involved in that building. It's possible it's an all-electric building, but that's very unlikely. So at some point we may need the gas board to give us, not necessarily shut it off, to give us advice on the gas. They don't always shut it down.
Right.
And so to get them there early assists us if we need to shut the gas off at some point, and the same applies to the electricity.
Right.
If there's a flat fire, normally electricity will be involved in some way because the electrical apparatus in there will catch light, or be damaged, I should say. Sorry.
Did you have any involvement with Cadent, who are responsible for gas supply, above and beyond sending this message?
No, my expectation that goes via the sector command of command support, and they would have set up a structure to deal with that.
Did you ever receive, later on in the night, after this, any reports from firefighters about the involvement of gas in the fire?
No, I think the only thing I found out shortly before I left was that the gas was in the basement of the building, and I think it was supplied all of the estate. I think I might have sent a crew down to make sure it wasn't in any way involved, because by that point you could expect water to be in the basement. But it just didn't become an issue. I think it was handed over to someone else to deal with, and it was very much towards the end of my time as operations commander.
Can I then turn to the question of RBKC's response, which we touched on yesterday when you referred to them as a Category 1 responder to a major incident. Do you recall seeing a gentleman called Shamshun?
You're right. No, sorry, you use an acronym, sorry. RCK, were you saying?
RBKC, sorry, Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea.
Sorry, thank you. I thought it was that, I just wasn't certain. Sorry.
Sorry, the council.
The council.
For want of a better word.
Thank you.
Do you recall at any stage seeing or meeting or speaking to a gentleman called Shamshun, if I pronounce that correctly, who is the head of supported housing for older people, who arrived at the coordinate around 1:30 and came onto the command unit at about 2 o'clock? Do you remember that?
No, not at all.
No. Do you remember the LALO, I'm sorry to use these acronyms, the Local Authority Liaison Officer, and Mr. Nicholas Layton coming to the command unit?
No, I didn't speak with him.
He says he came at about 2 o'clock to the command unit. You don't remember him?
No.
Right. What about slightly later in the night?
No, I didn't liaise with the LALO. Again, I would have expected that to go through the incident commander, or more likely the sector commander of command support. I think during my time in charge, the two agencies I spoke to were the police and ambulance.
Right. Now, do you recall speaking to or dealing with Mr. Robert Black, who was the chief executive of the TMO at any stage?
No.
Right. And what about Teresa Brown, the director of housing for the TMO? Do you remember dealing with her at all? Okay. Mr. O'Loughlin, you'll be very glad to hear, as I think will others, that I have no further questions for you. So that is the end of my questions to you. quite often there are one or two things which arise which I should just ask you. So I'm going to ask the Chairman to rise for 5 minutes or so to see if there's anything else I needed to cover with you. But subject to that, those are all my questions.
Thank you very much. Yes, well, it's usually convenient to have a short break now so Council can take stock. Sometimes there are a few additional questions. So we'll rise now and resume at 12:30. And again, talking about your evidence.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Thanks. You'd like to give the usher. Right, 12:30 then.
Thank you.
Right. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. If we can just have Mr. O'Loughlin back briefly.
Thank you. I think there are a few more questions.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Mr. O'Loughlin, really not very many at all, and I skipped over them, so forgive me. The first is, can I ask you please to go to the row log at page 1. And I'd like you to look, please, at the second time mark there of 0254, where he says, or it says, AC Row briefed DAC O'Loughlin as Operations Commander with responsibility for fire at FSG. First priority is to establish access and egress. The first is, do you remember being asked to establish access and egress as your first priority?
No, that part of that sentence I don't recall at all.
You don't recall at all.
Access and egress to the building we had at that point in time, it was through the south side of the tower still.
Yep.
Access and egress for the incident, we'd set up a rendezvous point in a marshalling area, so that wasn't my first priority.
Second question, do you recall during the period you were incident commander instructing a senior fire safety officer to examine the smoke vent system?
I remember a conversation about the smoke vent system when I was in the lobby. I think it was that it was on auto and that somebody said it seemed to have a fault. I didn't get drawn into it. I think whoever I'd spoken to, and it was one of the people in the lobby, I said either find a responsible person or get a fire safety officer to deal with it. I'm not sure I got a chance to follow up on it after that, or if I did, I was told it wasn't working. It was something like that.
Do you remember who you spoke to in the lobby who told you that it had a fault?
I can recall the officers in the lobby around that time, but I couldn't tell you which one of them it was. So, Glenn Williams was there, Andy Walton was there, Richard was there, but I can't recall who the conversation was with.
And you didn't take the fault point any further forward, is that right?
No, I asked them to deal with it. I think at that point it was still relatively early on. It was probably even my first or second trip into the building. Right. It was important, but I still had other priorities I had to deal with, which was speaking with Richard and Pat at that point.
Did anybody ever come back to you and update you as to the status of the smoke?
I think my understanding of it on the night was it wasn't working, and that was kind of the briefing I got, that it just wasn't working. Is how it was communicated to me. That's my only recollection of it during the night, was that it wasn't working.
Did you leave it? It sounds as if you left it at that.
Yes, I did. Yes.
Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. O'Loughlin. I have no further questions, it just remains for me to thank you very much, express our gratitude to you for coming to the inquiry and assisting us with our investigations. We very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you from me as well, Mr. McLaughlin. I'm sorry that it's taken rather longer than we'd hoped to hear all your evidence, but you had a lot of very important evidence to give. And I'm very grateful to you for coming along to give it. And now you're free to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your patience this morning in allowing me to go a little longer than I anticipated. I understand that Assistant Commissioner Rowe is ready to go, but obviously need 5 minutes or so to rearrange the furniture, or maybe. If we rose for 5 minutes, I think he's keen, and I'm certainly keen to get started and rise at 1 o'clock.
Let's do that. Yes, all right. Well, you come and tell me, or send the usher to tell me when you're ready.
Fine, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like now, please, to call Assistant Commissioner Andrew Rowe.
Thank you.
Please take your right hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
will be the truth,
shall be the truth,
whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rowe.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Rowe, good afternoon.
Hi, sir.
Can I say, first of all, thank you very much for attending the inquiry today and giving us your assistance. We very much appreciate it. My questions are designed to be short and simple. Sometimes they're not. If you want me to repeat any of them in any way, I will do, or put the question in a different way. If you need a break at any stage, just indicate and we can take a break.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, can I ask you first of all to look at your first substantive witness statement dated the 16th of August 2017, which is MET quadruple 07520.
Yes.
Have you read that statement recently?
I read it yesterday and I scanned it this morning.
Right. Can you confirm for us that its contents are true?
Yes, I can confirm its contents are true.
You also, I think, gave the police a second substantive witness statement on the 17th of January 2018, called Row 2 of 8 pages, and that is MET 000010065. Have you read that statement recently?
I have. That was at the request of the police, so they'd come back with some additional questions. Yes, I have.
Yeah. And can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true?
Yes, the contents are true.
Now, you've also, I think, given two other short witness statements. The first one, 16th of August 2017, which is MET quadruple 07521. You can just pick that out. Have you read or seen that one recently?
Yeah, this was about the submission of the decision log which Jackie McConaughey had kept for me.
Yes.
So yes, I think it was acknowledgement that had been submitted as evidence.
Yes, thank you. And the second one is the 24th of July 2017, which is MET quadruple 07522.
Yeah, and I think this refers to I think we were all asked as part of the process post-incident to make our own notes. So I think this refers to those being submitted as evidence.
Yes. Can I next show you your contemporaneous notes, which you've marked as Appendix A,
Yes.
at MET quadruple 05405?
Yes, I recognise those.
You confirm those are yours. They
are.
seem to have been started, if you look at the line just under the record of actions, on the 15th of June 2017 and completed on the 21st of June 2017.
That's right. I mean, it took me some time to complete them because I had to fit it in with my daily work of being an assistant commissioner. Right. So it was written over that time period.
Okay. Was it, when you wrote it, did you use an underlying document or database or record?
I used more than one document because I was in command of the incident for approximately 10 hours. I wanted to make sure that what I was writing was as accurate as possible based on the information that Jackie McConaughey had taken for me. So the decision log, which was sort of time-stamped in its own way, and also against the vision log, because I had made requests for resources multiple times across the span of the incident, and I would have no way of being able to accurately recollect the time I'd made those. And I wanted to accurately reflect that in my statement. And also, if I wanted to give me a sense of the timing for my own understanding of the incident, because I'd been in command for so long, really.
Right. Okay, thank you. We'll call that your contemporaneous notes. Can I next show you MET quadruple 5404, which is a transcript of the decision logging and tactical coordination meeting minutes for you. We've called that the row log, if you don't mind. That's probably the easiest way of doing it. It was logged, I think, by Jackie McConaughey, is that right?
That's correct. So one of my first actions on the night was I felt that the incident was of such an exceptional nature and so significant that I required someone to record my thought processes and decisions from the start, because I was under no doubt that I would ultimately probably be in a process similar to this, and I thought it was important to keep a record, really, for all of those people involved.
Right. And did Jackie write down in manuscript and then transfer it?
Yes. So she wrote, my understanding is she handwrote, well, I know for a fact, she handwrote 34 pages of notes across the night and then transcribed them into this document. But I believe the handwritten notes have also been submitted as evidence.
Okay. And did you get a chance to check this version, the typed version, against your recollection?
I got the opportunity to look at both versions, and I'm happy that those are an accurate reflection of what Jackie had recorded on the night.
Right. Are you, in general terms, happy not just that it's an accurate record of what she recorded on the night, but an accurate record of what you did and said on the night?
Yes, absolutely. Although there are occasions when Jackie wasn't with me, because Jackie remained on the command unit, where I would have made decisions and had conversations that are not recorded on that log.
Okay.
But in so much as Jackie, when I was present with her, was recording my decisions and rationale, absolutely yes.
Right. And of everything I've shown you, since you went to that stand, are you happy for all of that to stand as your evidence to this inquiry, subject to the questions I've got for you?
Absolutely, sir, yes. Thank you.
Can I now begin with your position and career? Now, you've worked, I think, for the LFB for some 16 years.
Yes, I joined the London Fire Brigade in January 2002.
Yes.
So just over 16 years.
Yes. And during your career, you've been a member of the ORT?
Yes, I was a member of the operational review team for a period of about 5 years.
And what was your rank on the night of the Grenfell Tower fire?
I was an assistant commissioner.
Right. And how long had you been an assistant commissioner for at that date?
I've been an assistant commissioner for approximately, put me on the spot now, I'm going to have to work it out, coming up to a year and a half.
Right. So you were made an AC in about, is this right, the January of 2016?
Was it 2016? No, it would have been 2017.
Right, so so you're now, okay, you've now been I see, right. But as at the night of the Grenfell Tower fire, you'd been appointed, you'd been an AC for 6 months.
I've been an AC for approximately 6 months.
Yes, I see. And before that, were you a DAC?
Yeah, I was Deputy Assistant Commissioner prior to that.
How long for?
For a period of about a year and a half.
Right. And before that?
I'd been a group manager for approximately 5 years.
I see, okay. Now, can you tell us what you did in your career prior to joining the LFB?
I was a commissioned Army officer, so I was a regular Army officer in the British Army serving in the Royal Regiment of Artillery. Right.
And when did you join the British Army?
I joined the British Army in 1996 and I left in 2000, so a short service regular commission.
And what was your rank when you left the British Army?
I was a captain, and at that point I was a second in command of a battery, so about 120 personnel.
Right. And had you seen active service?
Yes, I'd had a particularly active operational tour in Northern Ireland in 1998, where I'd been part of the response to the Omagh bombing, had been involved in very, very serious civil disorder, had been blown up myself, losing an RUC colleague at the time, unfortunately. So I'd been involved in a number of critical incidents, both shootings, bombings, serious civil disorder, over the course of that operational tour, leading approximately 45 soldiers at the time, so yes.
Right, thank you. And did you go into the LFB immediately after you left the Army?
Not immediately. Actually, I worked with refugee children briefly while I waited to complete the process to join the London Fire Brigade, because it takes a bit of time sometimes.
Right, okay. Now, can I take you diving straight into your second witness statement, page 4? And on page 4, at the very foot of the page, you say, the last time I received any formal training around incident command, I did the multi-agency Gold Incident Command course after December 2016. So were you an AC at that time?
I may well have been successful in the process. I'm not sure I've been appointed. I can't remember the exact dates, but it would have been relevant to me whether I was a DAC or an AC. In fact, I'd run the previous major incident where the London Fire Brigade had primacy, which was the Croydon tram crash as a DAC. So that course is relevant to anyone operating at that level, and it's a course intended to instruct you in the strategy of managing large, complex, multi-agency incidents. It's a good course, week long.
Right. Who delivered that? Do you remember?
It's delivered on a multi-agency basis, so you have kind of expert speakers from both the fire service, the police, local authority, government. The intent is really to expose people to the multi-layered decision-making that an incident like Grenfell is likely to encapsulate.
Were there any specific points you learnt on that training course which equipped you for command at Grenfell when you took it?
Yes, absolutely. I think both that course and actually my previous experience having run the Croydon tram crash, which was a significant major incident as well, multi-layered, many agencies involved, unfortunately a large loss of life, many similar pressures. I'd also been a national flood advisor, so I'd deployed out to Cumbria and had managed the LFB response out into major incidents for flooding across a number of years. And although it might not seem similar to Grenfell, actually, all of those experiences prepared me for running a major incident, because it's about the coordination of multiple assets, in a multi-agency environment. And that course in particular, I think, exposed me to the challenge of ensuring that whilst you adhered to the key objectives that were important to you, you took into account the nature of the objectives that other agencies will hold that are equally important, and sometimes managing the tension between them, ensuring that it's sat properly within a recorded decision-making environment. I thought it was a very good course.
Now, on page 5 of your statement, second statement, which is 3 lines down from the top, you say, "I've had years of incident command training on the middle manager training cycle, which would have involved firefighting in a high-rise block as an incident commander."
Yes, so I've been
I'm so sorry. Can I just ask? I know I'm going to ask you about that. Can I just ask a question? What did that training involve that you described there?
A variety of taught input. So someone talking about National Incident Command, for example, specific lessons around how you might structure a certain sort of incident, and then incident command exercises. So placing you in a position of a simulated incident as the incident commander or as a significant role in that simulated incident.
Right.
To give you that experience.
And how regular were those training sessions or courses?
So I've been a middle manager since 2000, in a temporary role from late 2007, at least yearly, and dependent on the cycle, sometimes twice a year.
Okay. What you say? Use the expression middle manager. What rank?
Station commander. Right, upwards.
Okay. And prior to June 2017, what was the last occasion that you yourself had incident command training for high-rise firefighting?
I think it was at the very start of 2017, so it must have been the last part of the Assistant Commissioner process where you have to take a realistic incident command assessment for the role. I think that would have been the last time. So whilst not training per se, right, it would have been the last time I'd been exposed to a challenging simulated environment.
Right. Mm-hmm. Also on page 5, just a little bit lower down, you say, my role at high-rise buildings, major incidents, is more about the command of them and not the physical firefighting itself. Does that describe your role as Assistant Commissioner?
Yes, I would see my role as Assistant Commissioner in ensuring that the primary objectives of the incident were driven forward, so the broad brush objectives, that I was managing the wider multi-agency political media environment in a pan-London context, thinking about the wider ramifications of what would be a very significant incident, and actually effectively putting in place a system and a structure at the incident based on delegated command. So I think it's very important to understand at my level you can't hold all the detail, and if you try to hold all the detail you're likely to lose your focus on the primary objectives, and therefore it's about ensuring the right people are in the right jobs based on their skills and experience to deliver against the core objectives, trusting people to take effective decisions based on their own decision making and their own experience. That would be the model I'd be working on, yes.
Right, okay. In the next sentence, you say, I was a member of the ORT and have attended a large number of high-rise and incidents. I think it should just be high-rise incidents. I have years of experience of high-rise fires as a firefighter, but also as ORT. And you go on to explain, as ORT, I had mobilised and advised on high-rise incidents and large fires all over London. And then you explain in some detail what some examples of that are. Were you involved in the Lakanal House fire?
I wasn't involved directly in the Lakanal House fire, no.
You say directly. Were you indirectly involved?
No, I was in the borough shortly afterwards. Right. So I understand the ramifications of the incident, but I wasn't directly involved in the incident, no.
Were you at Shepherd's Court?
No, I wasn't at Shepherd's Court either.
Were you involved in an indirect way in Shepherd's Court?
No. No. Although, like everyone else, I think at my level, I understand the ramifications of that incident and the learning that came from it.
Right, I see. Would the same apply to the high-rise incidents we've heard about earlier in this inquiry, Adair Tower and Trellick Tower?
Yes, probably not so much detail, but definitely Shepherd's Court and Lakanal. I think they were very significant learning for the brigade from both those incidents.
Right. What was the last large high-rise fire you attended prior to Grenfell, either as a firefighter or as ORT? Do you remember?
I can't remember what the last significant one would be, but the ones that stick in my mind, and that's why they're in the statement, would be a particularly challenging incident at Dolphin House in Deptford, where sadly 2 members of the public lost their lives, and where we'd had fire spread from within the original flat, and then a less challenging fire in Holloway in terms of the firefighting tactics, but one that involved a substation in the basement that then made the incident challenging. Right. They're the ones that stick in my mind.
In your experience, that you tell us about in your statement, have you ever experienced widespread compartmentation failure in a high-rise residential block?
No, and certainly not on the scale that I was presented with at Grenfell, which I would consider to be, if I'm frank, total building system failure. That was what I saw when I walked in towards the incident.
Do I take it from that you've similarly never been trained on widespread compartmentation failure in a high-rise residential block?
No, because of the stay-put policy, because of the way that building regulations work, it would be my expectation that we would not have to face a failure of compartmentation on that scale. I think the first rule of thumb as an operational officer and as an incident commander is you should always expect the unexpected, but we certainly wouldn't train to that scenario, because I think it would lead to perhaps poor decision-making potentially, because it might affect the way you took decisions. I think it's very important that the stay-put policy, which is based on a sound underpinning set of building regulations, is something that firefighters understand and would generally adhere to, because all of our experience, all of the statistics tell us that that's what keeps people safe generally in a high-rise fire.
Right. We're going to come and unpack that later on. It won't surprise you to learn. Just focusing a little bit more on your training, can you tell us if you personally have ever had any training on how to spot a cladding fire?
Not in the context of a residential high-rise, no, but I had received training on clad materials in a sandwich panels training package, which I think I probably completed online. I had undertaken some online training and probably delivered training around modern methods of construction and building construction generally. I think I'm privileged in the sense that I'd worked within our operational policy department. So that department is almost entirely focused on thinking about operational practice and policy and how it might be developed. So I've probably got a greater awareness of the possible effects of different methods of building construction.
Right. The operational policy department, forgive me for deviating, is that a department responsible for thinking up and drafting LFB policies?
Yes.
Right. And the operational policy department, what does that cover? Can you tell us?
So it's comprised of, it's changed slightly the structure, but at the time I was in it, it comprised of a team that was responsible for defining and developing operational practice in regard to firefighting. There was a separate team that I managed initially around technical rescue, so urban search and rescue, building collapse, all of our specialist skills. There was a hazmat team that dealt with hazardous materials. Actually, that was it at that point.
Right. Did it ever expand beyond those?
It's now taken on a wider role for operational assurance. So the department has expanded. So it's expanded the remit.
Right.
And has changed its structure.
Right. But is that post?
Not relevant.
Is that post Grenfell?
Yes, that's post Grenfell.
Okay. Now, look, What about FSG policy? Did that fit into your operational policy department?
It wasn't my responsibility, but it was held within the fire team. And obviously, I became Deputy Assistant Commissioner for that department, so I had overall responsibility for overseeing the day-to-day administration and management of the department under the overall leadership of an Assistant Commissioner.
I see. Okay.
So I assumed responsibility for all of the teams within the department.
Right. Were you ever involved yourself in meetings about how to revise or improve or change the FSG LFB policy in the light of Lacknell House?
No, I wasn't. That was well before my time.
Okay. Are you familiar with something we've called GRA, Generic Risk Assessment 3.2, published by the DCLG in February 2014?
Yes, I am. So that's the National Generic Risk Assessment for High-Rise Firefighting.
Are you... Let me just ask you to look at it. This is LFB quadruple 0 1255. And can I just ask you to look at one or two things in that? In general terms, though, first of all, I mean, this document has been around since 2014. When do you think you first became aware of it?
The London Fire Brigade was responsible for helping shape and guide this. So I was a group manager at the time running the technical rescue team within operational policy.
Right.
The other team, the firefighting team, was responsible partly for helping draft and shape this. So led by Assistant Commissioner Pete Cowap, who had the national lead for leading the working group on this. LFB was central to the definition and writing of this National Generic Risk Assessment.
Mm. Now, you told us earlier that as an incident commander at your level,
yes,
you would be reliant upon and you trust the delegated decision-making and experience of those under your command. My question is, to what extent would you trust them or rely on them to have detailed knowledge of any of the guidance in this document?
I wouldn't expect my junior officers to have any knowledge of this document, actually. This is a policy document that is set nationally and should be used within policy departments to develop the policy relevant to that fire and rescue service. So I wouldn't actually expect any of my officers outside the policy department to have read this. What I would expect them to do is to have read our high-rise policy upon which this is based and to understand how we take this generic risk assessment that applies to the whole country and apply it within the specific circumstances of the London environment.
Right. So, in a nutshell, 633 rather than GRA 3.
Absolutely.
Right. Is that a convenient moment, Mr. Chairman, for lunch?
Yes, I think it is. Sorry to stop you, as you've only just started giving your evidence, Mr. Rowe, but we all like to have a break for lunch, so we'll rise now. We're going to resume at 2:05. And while you're out, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything related to it. All right?
So,
right, if you'd like to go to the usher back at 2:05, please. Thank you.
I'm not going to cover rank and file never seen. And it's phase 2. You'll have to come back.
Good. 2:05 then, please.